In an earlier video on anime and soft power, I stated that, in my opinion, there is no country, no culture on Earth that has succeeded in the very intentional development of soft power in quite the way that Japan has. Specifically, I said that Japan was the best at soft power. This was met with a bit of disagreement in the comments. Mooney, said one commenter, "You as an American must not realize how ridiculous your statement is." Of course, everyone outside of America knows that it is the United States that has succeeded the most in developing soft power. Our people are now buying your blue jeans and listening to your rock music, right? Anyone who has opened a textbook on global studies or international relations can tell you that America won the Cold War through its soft power dominance, and that the US of A is the undisputed global soft power hegemon. Liberal democracy is the best system, so everyone wants to be a part of that system. But it is the very fact that every Political Science 101 student or player of Civilization 5 can rattle this off that betrays the truth of the matter. America's soft power dominance is not as clear-cut as it seems. Consider this. Everybody above a certain age in, say, Brazil loves Japan and has fond memories of Saint Seiya and Dragon Ball Z. Japan is the innocent nation in the eyes of the average Brazilian, the cool nation, the nation of good food and cool cars and anime waifus. And by proxy, Japanese people have gone from being undesirables in Brazil to both integrated and welcome. But what about the United States? Nobody in Latin America believes that the United States is innocent. You would have to be a fool. And yet, virtually all Latin American governments align themselves politically with the United States, right? Is that because of soft power? Is that because of McDonald's, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and Wiz Khalifa, or is it something else? The answer is clear when you think about it. These governments largely align themselves with the US, even against the interests of their own people, because if they don't, the Americans target them. And when these governments do cooperate, the Americans reward them. Or you see, American soft power doesn't really exist. What does exist is American hard power, of which the soft power is just a shadow, incapable of sustaining itself or surviving without said hard power. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's start by defining our terms. Soft power is defined as the ability to obtain preferred outcomes by attraction rather than coercion or payment. In other words, it's the power to get what you want with soft influence as opposed to with hard force. And it was coined by American political scientist Joseph Nye in his 1990 book Bound to Lead, in which he argued against the prevailing rhetoric at the time, which was that the United States was in decline and that it would soon be overtaken militarily by the Soviet Union and economically by Japan. He predicted that the United States would prevail because it had the ability to achieve its goals without force, but through attraction instead. And lo, the Soviet Union collapsed and Japan economically stagnated as predicted. The United States stood alone. This in turn elevated Nye to the status of prophet. He was right. American soft power carried the US beyond its rivals, and in the late 90s, we arrived at what political scientist Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. The United States had prevailed over the world. History is officially canceled. But just as how Nye didn't agree with the prevailing notions that America was in decline, so too were there political scholars who didn't agree with Nye's theory of soft power. For as much as we've discussed soft power on this channel, as much as the East Asian powers, China, Japan, and Korea, have all put enormous resources into the development of soft power, each in different ways, there is a countervailing argument which points to the American example as demonstrative proof that soft power cultivation, as we understand it, is not in and of itself possible without hard power. Joseph Nye, you see, is what one might call a neoliberal institutionalist. And neoliberal institutionalists believe that states care more about their own welfare than about outcompeting others. And thus cooperation can be beneficial for everyone even if the power is distributed unequally. If states care more about their own welfare, they argue, it is possible to utilize international law and organizations to cooperate between states to reduce uncertainty and create a rising tide that lifts all boats, which everyone should be happy with, even if some boats rise higher than others. Neoliberals presume that states, and individuals for that matter, won't care if the benefits are unfair as long as the benefits exist. If everyone is still better off, then surely the circumstances of cooperation are better than might makes right anarchy. But what if the balance is very, very unfair? What if the situation is less like a rising tide and more like an animal farm? All states, all countries are equal in cooperation together, but some states are more equal than others, right? What if these powerful states were more like predators and the weaker states more like prey, like farmers and their cattle? Enter the offensive realists, who argue that laws and institutions are not so much tools of cooperation as much as they are exercises in hegemonic power. And the arch-realist, if you will, the offensivist realist, is one John Mearsheimer, who argued that American soft power, all these things that Nye identified as America's greatest strengths, are just shadows of hard power, of forceful use of arms or economics. Which is not to say that Mearsheimer rejects the existence of soft power altogether. He merely posits that so-called attraction is really just military and economic coercion stacked up together in a trench coat. That soft power and hard power can exist at the same time, but that of the two, hard power leads and soft power follows. And Mearsheimer put all of his ideas on soft power vis-a-vis hard power into his own book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, where he predicted in part the decline of the American empire and the resuscitation of history, in the most bitterly ironic year possible, the year of our Lord 2001, whereupon history proved that it had a few tricks left up its sleeve. Which brings us back to Japan and the United States. Nye claims America won the Cold War through blue jeans, rock music, and fast food, through the superiority of liberal democracy and the free market. But Mearsheimer would say that it was more like aircraft carriers, the petrodollar, the CIA, and sanctions that carried the blue jeans and rock music. But it is one thing to make the claim and another to understand it. If we are truly to understand, we must observe the context. For you see, the American penchant for gratuitous hard power didn't come from nowhere. It's been a thread that starts at the very founding of our nation. Let us then take a journey through American history, just as we once did for Japan, to understand the careful interplay between hard power and soft power. In so doing, we will ask ourselves the fundamental question that Mearsheimer poses. Is American soft power a real thing? Is the American way somehow superior to other ways? Or is the very notion merely propaganda? If history ended in 1992 with the declaration of Francis Fukuyama and the victory of liberal democracy, then the beginning of history must surely be 1776, at the start of liberal democracy. There's a pattern in American history that is as old as the nation itself. The United States has always prioritized the use of force, but veiled it in the imagery and messaging, the propaganda of soft power. In so doing, we Americans shape the image we have of ourselves and attempt to shape the narrative of our history as it is perceived around the world. Consider our founding myth. The United States of America emerged from a union of 13 separate colonies, which were founded by 3 groups of people. There were the religious pilgrims who sought to escape tyranny and find religious freedom. There were the rugged pioneers who wanted to tame the wilds and grasp economic opportunity. And there were the political patriots, those noble men of reason who came to the Americas in search of liberty and enlightenment. The truth, however, is less flattering. Our founding religious pilgrims, the Puritans, were so radically intolerant and little-c conservative that they left England of their own accord before settling in the Calvinist Netherlands, only to discover that the Netherlands wasn't conservative enough and that their children were fleeing their internment, which in turn caused the Puritans to travel to the Americas where they could enforce their strict religious rules without fear of having the kids run off. The religious freedom that the Pilgrims desired was the freedom to restrict the freedom of others. Likewise, our rugged pioneers rolled in with their wagons not into untouched wilderness, as we Americans are often taught, but into already populated indigenous lands, which we Americans seized through conquest, broken treaties, and the spread of disease. Early Americans were colonizers who sought opportunity for themselves by pillaging it by force from others. And what of our founding fathers, our philosopher kings who bestowed upon our great nation its virtues and equal-mindedness? Their revolution was a revolution of the wealthy to escape the payment of taxes, for a war many of them directly supported and asked for. When the early US in turn overburdened its own people with heavy taxes related to war, it had no qualms about watering American soil with the blood of patriots, so long as the slaughtered were mere farmers, as was the case with the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. The Founding Fathers' ideas on equality and equality before the law didn't seem to apply to their many slaves either, or to women for that matter. They sought liberty for themselves, but did so through enforcing serfdom and even enslavement upon others. Which is to say, from the very beginning, the story of America is one of violence and subjugation, wrapped in the veneer of virtue. This veneer of virtue, this whitewashing, if you will, is not incidental. It is sustained through propaganda, the selective presentation of history, values, and identity in ways that make the exercise of power understandable and acceptable. But Mooney, if soft power is often defined as the ability to shape outcomes through persuasion rather than force, isn't that exactly what propaganda is? Well, not quite, because there is force. American propaganda legitimizes but seldom replaces coercion. As Mearsheimer says, soft power and hard power are not mutually exclusive. Instead, they function alongside each other, with soft power moving in after hard power to smooth its edges, moralize its objectives, and obscure its costs. And this moralizing and normalizing of hard power can be seen even in early American history, with the best example, perhaps, being the interplay between the concepts of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism.
You can define American exceptionalism in a lot of different ways. And the way most Americans define it is that America is a noble country. It's the city on the hill, and so forth and so on. And for somebody who studies foreign policy and does realism, it's hard to see the United States in those terms. As I said to you before, I think that we are an incredibly ruthless country. The amount of murder and mayhem that we've created around the world is just unbelievable.
Manifest destiny is the idea that America was chosen by God to expand its territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And American exceptionalism was the idea that the American people and their principles of democracy were uniquely good or even holy. This exceptionalism was then used to couch the violence and horrors and genocide of manifest destiny, draping the latter with legitimacy and even virtue. One of the first external references of America as an exceptional country, as a people and nation above that of any other in the world, comes to us in the musings of French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, Volume 2, Part 2, Chapter 9, page 36. And I quote, "I consider the people of the United States as that portion of the English people which is commissioned to explore the wilds of the New World, whilst the rest of the nation, enjoying more leisure and less harassed by the drudgery of life, may devote its energies to thought and enlarge in all directions the empire of the mind." The position of the Americans is therefore quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one. And indeed, let us not get it twisted, America was a rather unique country at the time. The United States was the first large-scale experiment of a contemporary constitutional republic without kings or hereditary aristocrats. In America, the enlightened thinkers of Europe, who yearned to cast off the yokes of monarchs, saw a blank slate onto which they could project their long-held aspirations. The violence, dispossession, and exclusion that accompanied this experiment were thereby often treated as incidental. For example, de Tocqueville writes concerning American treatment of the Indians the following: "The American government does not indeed rob them of their lands, but it allows perpetual incursions to be made on them. In a few years, the same white population which now flocks around them will track them to the solitudes of the Arkansas. They will then be exposed to these same evils without these same remedies, and as the limits of the earth will at last fail them, their only refuge is the grave." The Union treats the Indians with less cupidity and rigor than the policy of the several states, but the two governments are alike destitute of good faith. It appears a scathing rebuke of how the American government has treated its natives, and yet just a few pages later de Tocqueville writes, "The Spaniards were unable to exterminate the Indian race by those unparalleled atrocities which brand them with indelible shame. Nor did they even succeed in wholly depriving it of its rights. But the Americans of the United States have accomplished this twofold purpose with singular felicity. Tranquilly, legally, philanthropically, without shedding blood and without violating a single great principle of morality in the eyes of the world. It is impossible to destroy men with more respect for the laws of humanity." Even in the extermination of peoples, de Tocqueville saw America as especially virtuous, especially moral, and especially humane. Destroying people is just what civilization does. It's natural, it's fine. And nobody is better at philanthropically exterminating people than the United States, says de Tocqueville, in what is meant to be a compliment. Yet the American push westward was anything but humane. Consider, for example, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson. The act purported to be a humane solution, a voluntary exchange of tribal lands in the east for territory further west. This is the propaganda. In practice, it became the Trail of Tears, in which members of the Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, Cherokee, and Chickasaw nations were forced from their homelands by threat of arms. Around 15,000 Native Americans died along the way from starvation, exposure, and disease. In 1835, the United States unilaterally voided the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which gave the Indians of present-day Florida a reservation in the center of the state's territory. Upon voiding this treaty, the U.S. demanded that all Seminole Indians in Florida relocate to the newly assigned Indian territories in the state of present-day Oklahoma, as per the Indian Removal Act. Folks, Oklahoma and Central Florida are very far away from each other, and at least back then were very different places. For my European viewers, this is like if the government forced you to move from Paris to Bulgaria. You'd probably be a little upset too. The breaking of the treaty and forced removal led to the Second Seminole War, in which the United States waged a brutal campaign against the Seminole Nation, eventually culminating in General Thomas Sidney Jessup utilizing a scorched earth strategy, wherein the U.S. systematically captured and destroyed civilian Seminole homes, farms, livestock, and supplies, thus starving them out. A strategy that General Sherman would eventually emulate in his own march to the sea during the American Civil War. Jessup at one point even abducted Seminole leaders under the false flag of a ceasefire. This was the conquest of so-called barbarity by so-called civilization. It is impossible to destroy men with more respect for the laws of humanity. De Tocqueville was able to see the brutality of Indian removal and yet still admired it as humane, as virtuous. This is the power of propaganda. You can see the violence and still believe the story. The contradiction is not incidental. Violence is narrated as a moral necessity, thereby legitimizing the use of power. And once that logic has taken hold domestically, it becomes available as well to export, provided you have the strength to enforce your narrative.
There is no country in the Western Hemisphere that would violate the Monroe Doctrine. And that's a way of saying they understand full well that there are limits on what their foreign policy can be. And if they violate those limits, we will crush them. As you all know, the United States is an incredibly ruthless great power. We don't teach that in school, but that's the way the world works. We gussy it up with all this liberal ideology about how noble we are and so forth and so on. But you know better than to believe that, right?
Let me ask you, dear viewers, a question. If you are an American or study American history, can you name one war fought by the United States in the 1800s? This is actually a question that can be asked on the citizenship test, by the way, and the acceptable answers on that test are the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. So don't be glib and say, like, the Second Barbary War, because that apparently doesn't count for citizenship. That's relevant, though, because America doesn't really declare war. We just send our troops wherever we want to do whatever we want, regardless of whether we are welcome or not. Between the years of 1800 and 1900, for example, the United States deployed its troops abroad in demonstrations of force and exercises of hard power a little over 100 separate times. During this period, American forces were utilized to protect American interests in Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil, and Egypt and Korea and China and Japan and Angola, and Turkey, Greece, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, Cuba, Spanish Puerto Rico, the Argentinian Falklands, Libya, Algiers, Hawaii, the Marquesas Islands, Fiji, Samoa, Drummond's Island, Johans Island, Ryukyu, Taiwan, and the Philippines, all to protect so-called American interests. And remember, this is just the 1800s, so we're not even talking about either of the World Wars, the Cold War, none of it. Don't take my word for any of this. I pulled this list of, and I quote, instances in which the United States has used its armed forces abroad in situations of military or potential conflict or for other than normal peacetime purposes from none other than the Library of Congress. And these are just the quote-unquote notable ones. Indeed, the 1800s marked the beginning of the era of American imperialism. Consider the Monroe Doctrine, a foreign policy platform articulated in 1823 by President James Monroe, in which the president unilaterally declared that any attempt by European powers to intervene politically or militarily in the Western Hemisphere would be treated as a hostile act against the United States. In exchange, the U.S. promised not to interfere in the internal affairs of Europe nor in existing European colonies. This side of the world is our backyard, regardless of what the people living in said backyard might feel about it. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is taught in American schools and was portrayed in American media at the time as a noble declaration. The Monroe Doctrine was framed not as America asserting its imperialist dominion over half of the world, but instead as an anti-imperialist shield against European aggression, as the United States reluctantly stepped forward to take responsibility and be the adult in the room. In the 2 decades that followed the doctrine's enactment, the United States took numerous so-called enforcement actions to protect American trade. It was in 1846, however, during the presidency of one James K. Polk, Napoleon of the Stump, that any facade of the United States as a guardian of Latin American interests fell away, with the U.S. invasion of Mexico and the Mexican-American War. Mexico lost around 50% of its total territory during the war, which included the present-day states of California, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and parts of Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. In exchange, the United States agreed to pay $15 million for the physical damages of the war that they had started. In case you're curious, by the way, $15 million is about $480 million in 2026 money, which is around 1/5 the cost of a single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The war, though, was framed in America as a defensive response to Mexican aggression, spilling American blood on American soil, when in actuality President Polk had very deliberately engineered a territorial dispute and then moved American troops into contested land, provoking a Mexican response. The use of force, once again, is portrayed as reluctant but unavoidable. Do you see the difference here between the words and the actions, between the rhetoric and the behavior? They made us do it, and we're annexing land for our safety is a classic imperialist strategy. There's an underlying question here, though, that gets to the heart of soft power and hard power, that is not about rhetoric but is about the sequence. Which of these postures came first? Was this anti-imperialist imagery autonomous and self-generated, or was it derivative? Was this narrative merely a framing for the use of force? In the Monroe Doctrine, the answer is self-evident. There is consistent use of military force structured under conditions that make it appear reluctant, defensive, and unavoidable. It's one thing to observe the Monroe Doctrine's stated intentions. It is another thing to observe the behaviors that followed those intentions, and the incentives and structures that produced those outcomes. As we enter the 20th century, the relationship between force and framing becomes more explicit. For it is in the early 1900s, under none other than President Theodore Roosevelt, that American hard power stops disguising itself as reluctance and emerges instead as outright policy. The mask comes off, but the facade continues.
When someone makes a move of which we don't approve, who is it that always intervenes? UN and OAS, they have their place, I guess. But first, send the Marines.
In the year 1883, Joseph Pulitzer purchased The New York World, a newspaper based here in my home city of New York. In the early 1880s, the World was losing roughly $40,000 a year. That's about $1.3 million in today's money. By 1887, just 4 years after Pulitzer's acquisition, the paper was profitable enough for Pulitzer to purchase land in New York City for $140,000 and construct the New York World building at a cost of around $2 million, which is the total equivalent of around $68 million today. How did he do it? How did Pulitzer turn a failing newspaper into such a profitable juggernaut in so short a time? Pulitzer is best known today, of course, for the Pulitzer Prize in Journalism, which was established in 1917 through an endowment in his will to Columbia University. But Pulitzer was not a journalist by profession. He was a businessman, and the legacy he pioneered in American journalism was not detached, fact-driven reporting in pursuit of the truth of a matter, but the complete opposite. Pulitzer is credited with institutionalizing and arguably inventing yellow journalism. And yellow journalism has proven to be the gold standard for profitability in the field. As journalism historian Frank Luther Mott describes it, yellow journalism Number 1. It uses scare headlines in huge print, often sensationalizing minor news. Number 2. Lavishly uses pictures or imaginary drawings. Number 3. Uses faked interviews, misleading headlines, pseudoscience, and a parade of false learning from so-called experts. Number 4. Emphasizes full-color Sunday supplements, usually with superficial articles and comics. And number 5. Creates dramatic sympathy with the underdog against the system. In other words, yellow journalism relies on sensationalist titles, emotionally charged imagery, unqualified opinion masquerading as expertise, and a performative sympathy for the underdog, all engineered to maximize engagement. Which is to say, it's YouTube. And more broadly, it's the global standard for modern news.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Pulitzer's yellow journalism was a massive success. Out of economic necessity, it was copied and adopted by all of his rivals and institutionalized through philanthropy, such as through the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, which he founded. Now, the significance of yellow journalism is not that it made Americans more imperialistic or bloodthirsty. In fact, it was even utilized at times to criticize American power. What yellow journalism did do, however, was it trained its audience to interpret news emotionally rather than analytically. It supplied villains, victims, moral urgency, and narrative in advance of the facts. And by the late 1890s, this media ecosystem was already in place, just waiting for its moment to truly shine. For you see, by this time, Manifest Destiny had already achieved its continental task. The US stretched from sea to shining sea, and the frontier was declared closed. The urge to expand, however, remained, but for an obvious direction. The question on the mind of the American public was not whether the US should expand, but rather how and where. And the answer to that question was another question. Well, what's closest? Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba sat right at the edge of American economic and strategic interests. Remember that for decades, since the Monroe Doctrine back in 1823, the United States had treated the Western Hemisphere as its natural sphere of influence. Cuba, however, was still a Spanish colony and thus stood out as a conspicuous exception. By the 1890s, Cuba had become a fixture of American yellow journalism. Spanish authorities were portrayed in American newspapers as cruel and decadent. Cuban civilians were depicted as helpless victims, and to some extent both claims rested on real conditions. But the story removed the nuance, and complex political realities were stripped of their context and flattened into a simple moral narrative. There was a ruthless regime on one side and an oppressed people on the other, a potential republic, yearning to breathe free. Don't we owe it, then, to these people to give them the freedom they so desire? Instead of grappling with Cuba's political reality and the factual and historical context that is necessary to truly understand the events therein, readers were asked for something far simpler. How do you feel about Cuba? And as those feelings, divorced from context, sloshed around in the American consciousness, they began to generate pressure for action. The powder keg required but a spark. In January of 1898, an American second-class battleship, the USS Maine, was dispatched from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba, to do what else but to protect American interests during the Cuban War of Independence. The ship arrived on January 25th and sat in Havana Harbor until February 15th, when it promptly and suddenly exploded. 5 long tons of gunpowder charges for the ship's 6- and 10-inch guns had detonated, blowing off the front of the ship. And as expected of when the front falls off of a ship, the USS Maine promptly sank. Of the 355 crewmen, over 260 perished. The cause of the explosion was not immediately clear, but the response in the American press was decisive. Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and his chief rival William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal took immediately to sensationalizing the Maine incident, saturating the public with coverage. For a week following the explosion, the Journal devoted a daily average of 8.5 pages per day to the incident. Hearst himself announced a reward of $50,000, nearly $2 million today, for the conviction of those responsible. The World, on the other hand, did its part by continuously insisting that the Maine had been bombed or mined, and that Spain bore responsibility through purposeful action, knowledge, or negligence. Spain, the paper argued, could only atone for this heinous crime by granting full independence to Cuba. The unspoken part was that full independence for Cuba really meant dependence on the United States. Privately, Pulitzer stated that nobody outside a lunatic asylum really believed that Spain sanctioned the Maine's destruction. But public lunacy was and remains highly profitable. Emotional investment absent context maximizes engagement, circulation, and pressure for action. And with action came more stories, more engagement, and ultimately more profit. A loop was thus cemented into the American media landscape. The more eyes in the news, the more dollar signs you get. And if you just follow the prevailing narrative, you get more exposure and more political alignment, and thus you make more money. With the right incentive structures in place, you don't need to control the press. The messaging apparatus is self-operating. By April of 1898, the pressure had become impossible to release without action. Congress declared war on Spain, and what followed was a conflict that lasted barely 4 months. From a military perspective, the Spanish-American War was short and decisive, but from a political perspective, the war was transformative. The war started in April, but by August of 1898, Spain had been totally defeated, and the United States emerged from the war not merely as a great power, but as a colonial empire. Spain relinquished control of Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines to American rule. As for Cuba, it was granted nominal independence, but in practice, the island had been placed under lasting American supervision. The war was presented as humanitarian intervention, but the outcomes and the incentives that generated those outcomes were unmistakably imperial. Hard power had done the work, militarily against Spain and economically by aligning media incentives, and in turn, media framing rendered the outcome acceptable. What became, though, of the people whose suffering was used to justify the war? Remember the Maine, and don't forget the starving Cubans, declares this American cartoon dated May 7, 1898. The promise is clear. Intervention would relieve suffering. But in practice, relief was narrow and temporary. Sure, the exploitation of the Spanish regime was alleviated, but at the same time, though, American corporations moved rapidly into the Cuban economy, buying up plantation land, displacing small farmers, and vastly increasing inequality. The structural conditions that produced Cuban poverty remained intact, and in some cases even deepened under American supervision. The Spanish-American War exposed a contradiction that the United States could no longer manage. What exactly about the sinking of the Maine warranted the American occupation of the Philippines on the other side of the world? The gap between cause and consequence had grown too wide. The U.S. was past the point of narrative restraint. What it required instead was narrative cohesion, a framework capable of reconciling the open use of force with claims of exceptionalism and moral purpose. In so doing, the press and the media at large, through aligned incentives, could be made functionally subordinate to hard power doctrine. In the year 1897, President William McKinley appointed one Theodore Roosevelt to the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt was a hawkish man with a sharp mind and a pronounced belief in the moral utility of war. Later in that same year of his appointment, Roosevelt stated on record to one of the Navy's planners the following: "I would regard war with Spain from 2 viewpoints. First, the advisability on the grounds both of humanity and self-interest of interfering on behalf of the Cubans and of taking one more step towards the complete freeing of America from European dominion. Second, the benefit done our people by giving them something to think of which is not material gain, and especially the benefit done our military forces by trying both the Navy and Army in actual practice." The first viewpoint, you will note, is the old doctrine. Our intervention is inevitable, humanitarian, and anti-imperialist. But note the second viewpoint there, particularly the first half of it. Second, says Roosevelt, is the benefit done our people by giving them something to think of which is not material gain. What does he mean by this? Well, what Roosevelt is articulating here is the use of war as a civic instrument, as a means of disciplining the public, restoring purpose, and of reminding the nation that it is more than a commercial enterprise. Which is to say, the use of war as a distraction from other problems. You might feel ecstatic, even if you are about to starve, if the Mets look like they're about to win the World Series.
It's not always about the money, Spider-Man. It's about the Mets, baby. Love the Mets. All right, baby.
You might forget about the existence of certain compromising files exposing the unthinkably heinous crimes of the global elite, or your high cost of living, or your inability to buy a home if we're winning a war somewhere. This marked a profound doctrinal shift in American statecraft. Where earlier administrations treated war as a regrettable necessity, Roosevelt treated war as a societal benefit. War was something to be embraced, provided it was exercised for the right reasons and in the right way. The problem, of course, as we saw with the Maine, is that the right reasons and the right way are subjective and emotional standards, and those can be easily manipulated. On September 14, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States. And in 1904, Roosevelt articulated what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The original Monroe Doctrine, you will recall, was ostensibly a passive article, warning European powers against intervention, though we saw in effect how its outcomes and incentives played out differently. The Roosevelt Corollary took matters a step further and did away with any pretenses of passivity. The corollary was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine that, in practice, stated that the United States had the right and responsibility to intervene itself in Latin American nations experiencing what Roosevelt called, and I quote, chronic wrongdoing or impotence. This simple reorientation allowed for three things to occur. Number one, it gave the American military legal justification for intervention. You don't need an exploding ship anymore. Instability, by itself, a very loose and subjective term, is now sufficient justification for invasion. Number two, it positioned the United States as the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, cementing American claims as a regional hegemonic power. And number three, it redefined Latin American independence and sovereignty as no longer absolute. Sovereignty would only be respected insofar as it produced order compatible with American interests. In a manner of speaking, then, this was an expansion of American power, wealth, and influence, and even territory, not primarily through annexation, but through administration. Administrative expansion, however, is only credible when it is backed by force, by the persistent threat of hard power. Roosevelt understood this intuitively. He described this strategy as speaking softly but carrying a big stick. Doctrine could authorize intervention on paper, but authority still had to be demonstrated in practice. You have to see the stick in order to fear its wallop. In 1907, President Roosevelt ordered 16 American battleships to circumnavigate the globe in a demonstration of American power. The ships were freshly painted white, their movements were carefully choreographed, and their logistics capacity put to the test. This so-called Great White Fleet served as a demonstration to rivals, allies, and the American public alike that the United States had a modern, disciplined navy with a global reach. By this point, the fever pitch of the Spanish-American War had long subsided, and with it, the political necessity of yellow journalism as we knew it. Sensationalist media was not quite as appealing to the American public without a sensation to report on, and media coverage of the Great White Fleet reflected this shift. The press was not required to manufacture urgency or justify intervention, and thus it merely circulated images of American power as orderly, uncontested, and routine. In the absence of conflict, journalism and media had moved from mobilizing legitimacy of force to reflecting the normalization of it. Our power became a point of pride, and the use of our power legitimized alongside that pride. This same pattern, by the way, can be observed in the interventions that followed the Roosevelt Corollary, in the construction, say, of the Panama Canal, and in the broader management of American power in the early 20th century. But this foundation of hard power, still exercised primarily through military means, would soon be supplemented by another instrument. For you see, hard power is not merely expressed through armies and navies alone. As we enter the administration of William Howard Taft, we begin to see the second prong of hard power: economic coercion, investment, debt, and financial leverage, which emerge as a parallel mechanism thereafter of American hard power.
I wanted to ask you about Venezuela. When will you put fresh dollars into the country?
Yeah, we're currently operating under a system that's been approved by the U.S. Treasury and the Venezuelan government to recover debt that we're owed. We made some loans to their state-owned company many years ago, and they weren't repaid, and so we set up a mechanism to ensure repayment. Oil flows to the U.S., which is important for U.S. refiners. We're working our way through that, and we'll recover the debt over the next year or so, the final portion of it. And then we need a new set of fiscal terms under which we would invest in the country. Right.
In 1904, shortly after winning his second term in office, Teddy Roosevelt announced that he wouldn't seek a third term in 1908, stepping down to honor the two-term tradition. Roosevelt was immensely popular and could likely have won again, but instead he settled on supporting his hand-chosen successor, one William Howard Taft. For you see, Roosevelt was great at using military force, but clear hegemony required economic force as well. To that end, Taft, with his legal background, was a logical choice to continue Roosevelt's vision of American power. By 1908, the Roosevelt administration had asserted U.S. hemispheric dominance, modernized the Navy, and normalized intervention. These demonstrations of power, however, did not automatically translate into long-term durability. The next phase, then, involved embedding American influence into legal, financial, and institutional structures that could operate quietly, continuously, and internationally. With the right structures in place, the United States could maintain its vision of order by intervening with only its economics. This new doctrinal direction became known as dollar diplomacy. Rather than occupying territory outright, the US could control the levers of power by extending credit, restructuring debt, and placing American banks at the center of foreign economies. In so doing, this approach also expands the definition of stability. Remember that the Roosevelt corollary allows for American intervention in Latin America if a state becomes quote-unquote unstable. Through dollar diplomacy, the goalpost of stability can now be extended beyond political disorder or violence and into fiscal unreliability. A government that paid its debts, that protected American investments, that aligned its economic policy with American priorities could remain in power no matter how bad said regime otherwise was to its people, thanks to the backing of the United States, its financial institutions, and its military. The legitimacy and survival of a Latin American government then became primarily tied not to how well it could provide for the welfare of its people, but to how much they could please American financial interests, thus ironically widening inequality and creating greater instability. Where you see loans under dollar diplomacy were never neutral, and they still aren't. Debt was used to ensure the cooperation of foreign governments to American capital markets and financial institutions, and when compliance failed, military intervention followed soon after. Consider the case, for example, of Nicaragua, which was occupied by American forces from 1912 to 1933 as part of what are now called the Banana Wars. Whereas American interventions at the time in Honduras and Guatemala were primarily driven by the interests of United Fruit Company and the monopolization of banana exports, the American occupation of Nicaragua was a finance-centered intervention. In the early 1900s, Nicaragua was heavily indebted to European creditors. This European financial control of a country in America's sphere of influence, though, was considered untenable. Thus, during the Taft administration, American banks were encouraged to refinance Nicaragua's debt, and they were supported by the U.S. government in the process, thus placing Nicaragua's finances under U.S. supervision instead. Consider, for example, the Knox-Castillo Treaty of 1911, which consolidated Nicaragua's debts, replaced European creditors with American ones, and placed Nicaragua's customs revenue, the country's primary source of income, under direct American supervision. Now, the treaty was ratified by Nicaragua, but failed to secure ratification in the U.S. Senate, dying in committee. And yet, despite not having any binding treaty, U.S. control over Nicaragua's finances were de facto in place. American banks and State Department officials managed Nicaragua's debt through informal arrangements that favored American interests, effectively implementing the substance of the agreement without its legal form. These arrangements were deeply unpopular within Nicaragua, and President Adolfo Diaz, whose Conservative Party governed with American backing, was widely perceived as a client of foreign financial interest. In 1912, then, opposition crystallized around Luis Mena, the Nicaraguan Secretary of War, who accused President Diaz of, and I quote, selling out the nation to New York bankers. With the support of the National Assembly, then, Mena's opposition grew into a full-blown rebellion. And it's at this point that dollar diplomacy reached its limit, or one could even argue fulfilled its function. When the Diaz government appeared on the verge of collapse, and with it the informal financial regime underpinning American influence, the U.S. deployed the Marines to Nicaragua with the stated objective of restoring order. What the Marines did in practice was secure customs houses, protect a friendly government that prioritized American interests over its own people, and ensured that debt repayments continued to flow. In other words, the United States invaded Nicaragua, put its puppet government back into power, and occupied the country with the U.S. military to continue leeching the country's wealth. The occupation of Nicaragua lasted for over 20 years, concluding in 1933 during the height of the Great Depression. And this would hardly be the last time the United States interfered in Nicaraguan politics. In any case, the logic of dollar diplomacy is unmistakable, and its legacy continues to this very day. Finance and warfare are two prongs of the same hard power fork. When financial control proves insufficient to stabilize political compliance, military intervention follows soon thereafter as enforcement.
For might makes right. Until they've seen the light, they've got to be protected, all their rights respected, till somebody we like can be elected members of the...
We now have the foundations of American hard power, economic coercion and military intervention. But we haven't really touched much upon how soft power gets involved in that yet, except briefly and tangentially in our discussion of yellow journalism. Yellow journalism came into force as mass media became common in the form of newspapers, but the mobilization of emotion that came with it was incidental to the underlying profit-seeking. As we enter into the 1910s, though, we see the mass media landscape change quite substantially, just as the American model of power being built in the Western Hemisphere received its first real test in the wider world. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated on the streets of Sarajevo, Bosnia. A cascade of alliances and mobilizations followed, and Europe descended into war. The United States ostensibly remained politically neutral during the First World War, but neutrality did not mean detachment. American influence still found its way into the war. American banks, industries, and shipping interests were already deeply entangled in the conflict, and by the time the U.S. entered the war in 1917, it joined not as some reluctant outsider, but as a rising power whose material interests were already deeply committed. Which is to say, economically, the U.S. was already materially a member of the Allies. But how could the U.S. government bring the people along and commit the populace towards the deployment of that other prong of the fork, military intervention? There was no remember the Maine to hell with Spain. There was no Monroe Doctrine. This was not a frontier war for manifest destiny, nor a hemispheric intervention. This was a distant, abstract, and industrial conflict over there. It demanded mass mobilization of national resources and manpower, economic sacrifice, and political conformity on a scale that the United States had never before experienced. This was total war. And the existing media ecosystem, still decentralized and profit-driven, could not manufacture the consent for America's participation in said war. As such, in 1917, as America entered World War I, President Woodrow Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI. The CPI was a government agency created specifically to influence public opinion to support the U.S. war effort, both at home and abroad. Unlike the yellow journalism era, where newspapers manufactured emotion chaotically in pursuit of profit, the CPI coordinated newspapers, films, education, and public speeches in the explicit service of the war effort. Now, the CPI operated through a multi-pronged approach. First, it enforced narrative discipline largely through access to information, which is to say, the CPI encouraged media uniformity of message by incentive. If your newspaper followed the official CPI-sanctioned narrative of the war, then you received privileged access to war reporting, to interviews, and to official materials. And if you didn't, you faced exclusion and had no access to what was on everybody's minds. Second, the CPI saturated public spaces with propaganda. Numerous pamphlets, newspaper releases, films, and magazine advertisements were distributed nationwide. School curricula were adapted to encourage the war effort, and volunteer speakers were even trained to give patriotic speeches during 4-minute movie intermissions. George Creel, the head of the CPI, once boasted that in 18 months, his 75,000 volunteer speakers had delivered over 7.5 million 4-minute orations to over 300 million listeners in a nation of only 103 million people. Last but not least, of course, the CPI framed dissent as dangerous and seditious. Labor activists, socialists, and pacifists were cast as internal enemies, and war hawks were cast as patriots. This narrative environment helped to normalize the enforcement of the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which criminalized opposition to the war, criticism of the government, and even disloyal or abusive language about the Constitution or military. These two acts, by the way, even during the time, were widely viewed as very severe violations of free speech by the general public, and yet the CPI made them amenable, somehow, to that same public. Consider the case of Eugene Debs, a prominent socialist and one of the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World. Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison in 1918 after delivering a speech in Canton, Ohio, in which he strongly criticized the Espionage Act. Debs appealed his case all the way up to the Supreme Court, which ruled against him, and his conviction was upheld based on the precedent set by another case, Schenck v. United States, which concluded that speech with the potential to undermine society or the government was not protected under the First Amendment. Fun fact, the Espionage Act is still in effect today. A law so broad and unfairly drafted that mounting a defense against the Espionage Act has been described as, quote-unquote, almost impossible, if not impossible, by fairness and accuracy and reporting journalist Chip Gibbons, and described as, quote, so broadly written that a defendant would be convicted no matter what, by Trevor Timm, the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And the American public fell for the propaganda hook, line, and sinker. The Germans were engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking our merchant ships for no good reason, despite the fact that we were selling the Allies supplies, which directly threatened their war effort. There was the Zimmerman telegram, which purported to be a secret message from Germany to Mexico, which proposed that if Mexico invaded the United States, the Germans might help the Mexicans retake Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Even though the Germans hadn't attacked us yet, Why, they could attack us at any moment, and with Mexico's help, no less. This is not meant to be a defense of Germany in World War I, mind you. What we're looking at here is strictly at how propaganda functions. For you see, the propaganda utilized here is coercive in nature. Now to be clear, not all propaganda is necessarily coercive, but this form is. The consent for war is manufactured, the media is aligned through the correct incentives, and the opposition is brutally silenced. In turn, this manufactured consent, which we'll broadly continue to call propaganda for convenience, is not soft power. Remember, soft power is influence without coercion, and this form of propaganda is coercive. The armistice of November 11, 1918, ended active fighting between the Allied powers and Germany on the Western Front. Although the war wouldn't be formally concluded until the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on June 28, 1919, the armistice nevertheless marked the practical end of World War I as a military conflict. The United States emerged from the war in a uniquely advantageous position. Unlike the European powers, the American homeland suffered no physical devastation. Wartime mobilization had expanded U.S. industry, American agriculture had supplied global markets, and American banks had extended vast loans to the Allies. By 1919, the United States had shifted from a net debtor nation to the world's leading creditor. After but a brief but sharp post-war recession in 1920 to 1921, the American economy entered a period of sustained expansion. This period of relative stability and industrial productivity became known as the Roaring Twenties. But what happened to the CPI and all the media infrastructure that had developed around it during World War I? Well, it didn't just disappear, it was instead repurposed. Techniques pioneered by the CPI migrated into advertising, into public relations, film, and radio. Consider, for example, one Edward Bernays, one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century, but one whom you've likely never heard of. Bernays was the so-called father of public relations and pioneered the field of PR as we know it today. During World War I, Bernays worked in the CPI for its Bureau of Latin American Affairs, where his job was building support for the war both domestically and abroad, with a focus especially on businesses operating in Latin America. Bernays described his work as, and I quote, psychological warfare. Not very soft power, is it? Very hard power. Bernays later stated of his work in the CPI the following, quote, "There was one basic lesson I learned in the CPI, that efforts comparable to those applied by the CPI to affect the attitudes of the enemy, of neutrals, and people of this country could be applied with equal facility to peacetime pursuits. In other words, what could be done for a nation at war could be done for organizations and people in a nation at peace." And Bernays did just that. After the war in 1923, Bernays wrote his first book, Crystallizing Public Opinion. In 1929, Bernays organized a successful advertising campaign encouraging women to smoke more cigarettes. Fun fact about that campaign, by the way, Bernays' cigarette ad campaign actually co-opted first-wave feminism. He paid women walking in the Easter Sunday parade to smoke so-called torches of freedom, including women's rights activist Ruth Hale, who was infamously filmed during the parade stating, "Women, light another torch of freedom, fight another sex taboo." Which just goes to show you, the co-opting of feminism by capital is by no means new, and it's something for all of us to be vigilant of, but I digress. In 1928, Bernays published Propaganda, arguably his most influential book until The Engineering of Consent, which was published in 1955. In Propaganda, Bernays wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate these unseen mechanisms of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country." You see, for Bernays, democracy wasn't a function of an informed public rationally deliberating policy, as we often imagine it to be. Instead, Bernays saw democracy as a function of, and here is this term again, manufactured consent. The role of the media, of advertising, of public relations was not to inform citizens neutrally, but to guide behavior, to reinforce their beliefs, and to align mass psychology with institutional needs. Now, to the casual observer, this resembles authoritarianism, but Bernays didn't see it that way. He saw it instead as a necessity in a society too complex for direct understanding. Persuasion is the next best thing. Don't understand, instead feel. And in Bernays' logic, the capitalist system requires this to survive. Mass production requires mass consumption. There's no reason to produce a ton if there's nobody to consume it, right? Mass consumption then thereby requires managed desire. You can't get people to consume a ton unless they really want to. Managed desire then requires psychological coordination. Those who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses, writes Bernays, have pulled the wires which control the public mind. And to that end, Bernays saw no distinction between commercial persuasion and political persuasion. Propaganda, he writes, is the executive arm of the invisible government. This is why the American government has never needed to outright subordinate the press in the manner of authoritarian regimes. The forces of capital already discipline the media. As we've shown, doctrine subordinates journalism not through coercion but through aligned incentives. Bernays was onto something. He had identified, perhaps before anyone else, the propaganda model of mass media in capitalistic democratic societies. The very same model that Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky would later write about in their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent: The Political Economy of the Mass Media. Herman and Chomsky argue that news passes through 5 key filters. First, media outlets are large corporations which reflect corporate interests. That's obvious, right? Second, these corporations then depend on advertisers and thus try to avoid content that might upset their financial benefactors. Third, the journalists in these corporations rely on government and corporate sources, which discourages adversarial reporting. Fourth, negative responses in the form of lawsuits, complaints, or outright political pressure punishes dissenting views. And lastly, there is a dominant ideological framework which frames what is considered acceptable discourse. Which is to say, the boundaries are established to generally exclude certain types of thinking by limiting the spectrum of acceptable opinion while simultaneously allowing lively debate inside of that spectrum, which gives the illusion of free thinking, all while the presuppositions of the system are reinforced by the limit of the debate. These are the aligned incentives to which Bernays hints at and which were already visible in the late 1920s. These aligned incentives, however, were about to face their first true stress test. In October of 1929, the American financial system collapsed, and what followed was a crisis not merely of economics but also of credibility. For you see, for a decade, Americans had been told that the markets were rational, growth was permanent, and progress inevitable. Now, before their eyes, that narrative no longer described reality. What followed was what we call the Great Depression. And just as how the Depression forced individuals and families to figure out how they might survive economically, it also forced institutions to discover which communicative practices still functioned under the conditions of systemic failure. Given the circumstances, reassurance based on prosperity or consumption no longer worked, and persuasion that assumed that confidence risked producing cynicism instead. You can't just tell people that things are great when they aren't, or people will start to disbelieve. And so the propaganda apparatus turned inwards. By such tools, electricity dispels the dark and lifts heavy burdens from human shoulders. Hence, the letters GE are more than a trademark. They are an emblem of service, the initials of a friend. Times aren't great, but we are part of what makes the rest of your life bearable, so, it's not our fault. You might recognize this kind of corporate behavior during other periods of economic recession or hardship, by the way, when the system is tested. What this is propaganda. In any case, this self-preservation mechanism meant that when the United States once again faced total war, it did so with the media ecosystem intact, and already accustomed to participating in wartime mobilization from World War I. Once again, all that was needed was a spark.
Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the American conscience and served as the perfect catalyst. Once again, the United States found itself dragged into a major war, but this time, at least on the home front, America was more prepared. Once again, the U.S. government coordinated messaging and morale through centralized institutions, most notably through the Office of War Information, or OWI, established in 1942. Hollywood studios, radio stations, newspaper publishers, and advertisers alike rapidly aligned with the war effort, often proactively. Many of them remembered what it was like to starve, and they were eager to get back into the groove of things. Just like with the CPI, cooperation promised access, legitimacy, and thereby profitability, whereas opposition offered none of the above and potentially even negative responses. Everybody knew the rules of the game. The incentives were already in place. Film studios produced patriotic features and newsreels and training films. Radio broadcasts blended entertainment with war news and moral framing. Even advertising adopted wartime themes linking consumption to sacrifice and duty. the line between entertainment and propaganda became increasingly blurred. Now, it's worth noting that the United States was not unique in deploying propaganda during World War II, of course not. What distinguishes American deployment of media in World War II is not merely the existence of propaganda, but how thoroughly said propaganda integrated into the commercial entertainment and everyday culture, specifically through aligned incentives rather than through centralized coercion. There was the overt federal government-produced stuff, such as Frank Capra's Why We Fight, a genuinely fascinating series of films that I've referenced multiple times in past videos. But there were also more direct private-public partnerships, which co-opted the existing commercial media sector. During World War II, Disney produced hundreds of films for the US government, and in some cases allied war efforts, including training films, instructional shorts, morale pieces, and more, often working directly with the Office of War Information and the armed forces themselves. Consider, though, Disney's wartime output was not primarily designed to persuade Americans or allies that the war was just. By 1942, that question had already been rather decisively settled. Instead, Disney's films taught audiences how to live in a wartime society, which is to say, Disney's animations were not needed to legitimize war, they were instead used to normalize war. Consider, for example, the Disney cartoon The Spirit of 43, a cartoon starring Donald Duck produced for the US Treasury. The cartoon does not show Pearl Harbor or give justification for the war. What the cartoon does is it teaches viewers to pay their income taxes, and it frames taxation as this cheerful civic duty with compliance linked to national unity. In other words, Spirit of 43 instructs citizens how to function inside of and make sense of wartime bureaucracy. Consider also the rather infamous Der Führer's Face, a satirical short in which Donald Duck has a nightmare in which he is a Nazi instead of a God-fearing American. Again, the enemy is not up for debate. Instead, fascism is rendered absurd through caricature and ridicule. But you will note that there is no understanding here to be gleaned about what anyone actually found appealing about fascism to begin with. This is a pattern in American media. Once again, complex ideological conflict is flattened into something emotionally legible. The viewer is not asked to reason through the nature of fascism. They are instead invited to feel alignment instinctively. But Mooney, I can hear you say, are you really suggesting that we should have to think about why Nazis, fascists, or imperial militarists are wrong? Shouldn't that be obvious? Look, the problem isn't about having a sense of right or wrong. You should have that. The problem is developing a sense of right or wrong without any foundational understanding. When alignment is learned through feelings rather than analysis, the alignment becomes detachable from its context. Let me explain, right? If one only learns that Nazis were the enemy and that they wore skulls on their hats, but not why they were the enemy, then when the same logic returns in a different uniform without skulls on their hats, will it be recognized? If there is no foundational understanding, if you do not understand the context, then your moral orientation becomes portable. A vibes-based, effective understanding of morality can be redirected without arguments, and new enemies can be manufactured for feelings to latch onto. Which is to say, morality built on feelings but without underlying logic or reasoning can be redirected also without logic towards new heroes or villains. And said villains don't even have to be real, they only have to feel real. And by proxy, once media succeeds in normalizing power in this way, legitimacy no longer depends on persuasion at all. It depends only on the continuity of narrative and control over framing. Consider how this was employed during and after World War II. The Japanese went from subhuman, conniving gremlins to our beloved and culturally sophisticated friends. The Chinese went from the undesirable yellow peril to the people of peace and culture, to the communist menace to our open market good commie neighbors, to the nefarious enemy of the free world in the span of a single century. And as for the Russians, well, that finally brings us into the Cold War.
You might call this a college town, communist style, as part of a long-range plan to destroy our free way of life. These young communists are studying the economic, political, and religious institutions that are the very heartbeat of America. The courses here in this strangest of all schools: espionage as a science, propaganda as an art, sabotage as a business.
The end of World War II saw the United States and the Soviet Union emerge as the world's two dominant powers, each representing a fundamentally different political, economic, and ideological system. Though they'd been wartime allies against the Axis powers, this partnership quickly gave way to conflict. In February of 1946, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow, one George F. Kennan, sent an unusually lengthy correspondence back to Washington which would later become known as the Long Telegram. in it, Kennan argued that Soviet behavior could not be understood through the lens of short-term interest or diplomatic misunderstandings. Instead, he described the Soviet system as fundamentally and ideologically committed to conflict with capitalism, because the legitimacy of the Soviet regime depended on the existence of this conflict. At the same time, Kennan also observed that Soviet leaders were not irrational. They were risk-averse and primarily concerned with internal stability. As such, Kennan believed that while the Soviet Union would seek to expand its influence wherever resistance appeared weak, it would avoid direct military confrontation with a stronger opponent. From this analysis emerged the strategy of containment, not the destruction of the Soviet Union but the long-term prevention of its expansion. Now, Kennan's diagnosis carried a profound strategic implication. If direct war between America and the Soviet Union was both undesirable and potentially catastrophic, and neither side was committed to diplomacy, then conflicts could only be resolved by proxy. On the surface, this war of proxies appeared to be a clash of influence and alignment, wherein culture, education, and information systems became the instruments through which said alignment was to be produced and maintained. Soft power. But both sides understood from the get-go that this soft power was but a facade. In his 1961 farewell address, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a five-star general who had overseen the Allied victory in Europe, warned the American public about what he called the military-industrial complex, a permanent armaments industry intertwined with government planning capable of shaping national priorities in peacetime and sustaining a permanent war footing. Eisenhower's warning was not limited to weapons alone, though. For you see, total war had required not merely factories and armies, but as we saw, systems for managing perception. Propaganda offices, press coordination, right? And just like the factories, just like the military bases, these systems of perception control were never fully dismantled either. Just like in World War I, they migrated, embedding themselves into commercial media, into advertising, not generally through overt censorship or control, but once again through aligned incentives. It was a military media axis built semi-purposefully, sure, but reinforced and cemented capitalistically. It was the product of this self-reinforcing system that theorists would later describe, most notably American political scientist Joseph Nye, as soft power. Soft power, you may recall, is defined by Nye as the ability of a state to shape the preferences of others not through coercion or payment, but through attraction. Where hard power operates through military force or economic pressure, soft power operates through culture and political values and perceived legitimacy. In Nye's framework, a country gets others to want what it wants because its way of life appears more desirable than other ways of life. Importantly, Nye does not deny the existence or importance of hard power. His argument is not that tanks or nukes were irrelevant during the Cold War, but that they were insufficient on their own. Nuclear weapons constrained direct confrontation, and as we will see, economic coercion had its limits. What ultimately mattered, according to Nye, was which system people believed in. And from this perspective, the Cold War was not won primarily on the battlefield, but in the realm of perception. Now, at first glance, Nye's theory maps remarkably well onto Cold War outcomes. Here's the typical Nye argument. The United States did not conquer most of Western Europe through force. Most of those states aligned themselves willingly with the Americans and allowed American military bases to be placed in their territory. American political institutions remained stable. Consumption expanded and cultural products from Hollywood to fashion to popular music circulated globally and were widely consumed even in societies that formally opposed American foreign policy. By contrast, the Soviet Union struggled to generate comparable cultural attraction. While it possessed immense military power, its political system seems to have inspired fear more often than admiration, and restrictions on speech, movement, and cultural exchange appeared to limit the appeal of the Soviet model. If seen as a competition between these two visions of modernity then, the American model, Nye argues, proved more attractive not just to foreign governments or elites, but to the populations themselves. This attraction then shaped patterns of alliances by influencing newly decolonized states deciding which bloc to join or emulate. Soft power, according to Nye, is not merely about winning friends and influencing people, it's about creating durable systems of cooperation, which is to say, you don't need to threaten or coerce as often because others already share your base assumptions about order and progress and are thereby keen to follow along. Which brings us back to the beginning of the video, right? Nye's point of view is that American cultural influence during the Cold War was the defining asset of American victory. Our system generated more genuine attraction than the Soviet system. It's a very comforting narrative, isn't it? If power can be exercised through attraction rather than force, then leadership can be benevolent instead of domineering. Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. But as we continue, let's revisit a question that we've already asked. What order does power operate in? Does American culture persuade the world on its own, or does it circulate because military, economic, and institutional power have already structured the field in which choice becomes possible at all? In other words, is Nye describing an independent form of power? Or is this soft power simply what American hard power looks like once victory has already been secured? Is joining the American cultural sphere actually a choice, or is it made within a lattice that constrains the very capacity to choose? Neoliberal institutionalism argues that while the international system may be anarchic, states are not condemned to perpetual conflict. International institutions such as alliances, trade regimes, norms, and organizations can reduce uncertainty, facilitate cooperation, and shape state behavior over time. As long as the system produces broadly rising prosperity, disparities of power can be tolerated or even normalized. There is, however, an older and far more pessimistic tradition in international relations theory upon which neoliberal institutionalism is partially built. This school of thought is known as realism. Realism as a theory of international relations is as old as Thucydides, but it emerged into contemporary prominence in the aftermath of World War I, as a response to what its proponents viewed as the naivete of classical liberal hopes for lasting peace through institutions and norms. Classical realism begins from the same foundational premise as neoliberalism. The international system is anarchic in nature. There is no overarching authority capable of enforcing rules between states. But modern realists draw a different conclusion. Because survival is at stake, power, both military and economic, becomes the central currency of international politics. Might, in other words, makes right. Now, among contemporary realists, few figures have been more influential than our friend John Mearsheimer, the leading proponent of what is known as offensive realism. What's the difference between classical realism and offensive realism, you ask? Well, where classical realists argue that states seek security through power, offensive realists go a step further, arguing that the anarchic nature of the international system drives great powers to maximize power to ensure their survival and dominance, which in turn makes cooperation fragile and often a temporary tactic of positioning and posturing. The safest position in an anarchic system is not balance or even advantage, but hegemony. The safest place is to be the most powerful actor in your region without peer competitors. Mearsheimer then does not deny that culture or ideology or legitimacy matter. What he rejects is the claim that these forces operate independently of material hard power. From an offensive realist's perspective, attraction does not generate power. Power generates the conditions under which attraction becomes possible. Which is to say, the United States is not the best at soft power, nor even number one at soft power. It's the best at hard power, and the attraction is secondary to and structured by and even forced by the underlying material hard power. And this distinction becomes critical when we turn to the Cold War. In the United States, the Cold War is often taught in schools as a battle for hearts and minds, one that the US won without direct conquest as per Joseph Nye. But from an offensive realist perspective, this framing mistakes the outcome for the cause. The question isn't whether American culture appears attractive, but whether that attraction can exist without a global system of military bases, covert interventions, economic coercion, and institutional control that underpins it. Because, in truth, the Cold War was hardly cold, and large-scale conflict emerged only a few short years after the Long Telegram. In 1950, the United States intervened militarily on the Korean Peninsula, marking the first major armed conflict of the post-war order. The war ended in a stalemate, with a divided peninsula, a permanent U.S. military presence, and a frozen conflict that persists to this very day. And one of those remnant states, South Korea, did not align with the United States because of cultural attraction or shared values. The South Korean people are utterly miserable, with 80% of the younger generation wishing to leave Korea, 80% of young people viewing South Korea as hell, and over 80% of younger and older people believing that people born into poverty can never compete with those born into wealth. The government is extremely corrupt. There's a joke in South Korea that goes something like this: why does every president pardon the previous president when they come into power? So that the president after them will pardon them too. I made a whole video on this topic, so I won't go back over every little detail, but South Korea and its government and its oligarchic chaebols persist because American power guarantees their survival. The attraction, or perhaps more accurately, the acquiescence, follows the force. South Korea could not choose differently. and Korea established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Cold War. Military force was used not to conquer but to stabilize environments favorable to American dominance, which was then subsequently normalized and reinforced by American soft power initiatives post hoc. America would vassalize instead of annex. Now, in the equal and opposite direction, North Korea was utterly destroyed by the United States and then sanctioned thereafter in a campaign that was nothing short of genocidal. Have you ever seen those memes that show North Korea at night compared to South Korea? Oh, North Korea under the tyrannical Kim regime is so backwards and economically incompetent, why they can't even get electricity to their people. You want to know why North Korea has such poor power infrastructure and development? It's because we, the Americans, destroyed all of it. 18 out of 22 of North Korea's major cities were at least 50% destroyed as per Bruce Cummings' The Korean War, A History. Of those major cities, 4 were destroyed by the US Air Force's own estimates over 90%. The city of Sinanju was completely razed to the ground, with an assessment of 100% destruction. The American bombing campaign destroyed almost every single building in all of North Korea, and this included factories, power plants, schools, hospitals, government buildings, and civilian infrastructure. On May 13, 1953, the 58th Fighter Bomber Wing destroyed Toksan Dam, drowning Pyongyang. That same month, we continued by bombing Chasan Dam and then Kuwanga Dam, Namsi Dam, and Taechung Dam, which caused unbelievable damage, drowned many thousands of people, and swept away enormous swaths of valuable farmland. Around 15% of the entire North Korean population was killed during the war. And according to the United States, all of these obvious civilian structures were, and I quote, military targets. And then, after we reduced all of North Korea to literal mud huts, we sanctioned it, closing off North Korea's access to the global economy, causing mass starvation and continued struggle, which we then blame on our victims. And then we have the audacity to make memes about how they don't have lights.
And the North Koreans have suffered because the United States has done everything we possibly could to destroy the economy of North Korea. We've done everything we possibly could to boost the economy of South Korea. And then we condemn them because they are backward and because their people are starving.
This is the other half of our Korean War lesson. After the war, in South Korea, American capital built and protected an allied order with investment, access to markets, treaties, and aid. In North Korea, we did the opposite. We destroyed any and all development in the country, we isolated it from the global economy, and then we treated the resulting poverty as proof that a rival system had failed on its own. If Korea then shows us what the open military intervention version of hard power looks like in the Cold War, the next question is, well, what does intervention look like when we don't send in the Marines? And for that, we have to talk about covert intervention and the CIA.
We caught an American CIA agent trying to subvert our intelligence special branch officer. Bribe him so that the special branch officer will feed the CIA, because the CIA wants to know what's happening. And I told the American government, all right, we keep quiet, you take this man away. $100 million to the Singapore government for economic development. You know? No, listen to me. I didn't tell, I never spoke to the Americans direct because, they lack the finesse, and they may say, yes, hey, give it to you. Why not? Why should the Singapore government just give to you, to me, which would have ruined me? But through an intermediary, they offered me and my party $10 million. I mean, the insult, I told them, keep it.
The CIA did a lot of crazy stuff during the Cold War. We could go into all of it in detail, but this video's long enough as it is. Like, just the big interventions are enough for whole videos on their own. There's Operation PB Success in 1954, where the CIA overthrew the democratically elected president of Guatemala. There was the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, wherein the CIA attempted to invade Cuba. There was Project Camelot, wherein the CIA spent tons of effort and money from the 50s to the 70s trying to silence leftist Democratic candidates in Chile, contributing to the eventual military coup which put the brutal dictator Augusto Pinochet in power. These examples kind of go against the rhetoric that all nations who joined with the United States did so due to attraction or soft power, doesn't it? The choice wasn't join with the United States or with the Soviet Union, it was join with the United States or face the constant, never-ending bombardment of CIA destabilization, military pressure or outright invasion, and economic sanction, which we'll get to. Though there are many examples of CIA destabilization, let's focus in on one particularly relevant example of how American hard power operates and how soft power alone is simply insufficient where hard power fails.
Even with your enemies, even with your adversaries, I do think that you have to have the capacity to put yourself occasionally in their shoes. And if you look at Iranian history, the fact is that we had some involvement with overthrowing a democratically elected regime in Iran.
On April 28, 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh was elected as the Prime Minister of Iran. Now, Mossadegh was extremely popular. He'd won the election through massive public support on a message of ending the exploitation of foreign actors in Iranian affairs. Mossadegh pursued many popular reforms, such as introducing unemployment compensation and forcing factory owners to pay benefits to sick and injured workers. But Mossadegh's primary mission was to end foreign control of Iranian oil, which came about due to concessions made to the British by the reigning monarchs, the Shahs of Iran. In March of 1951, Iran nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British-controlled firm that had long dominated Iran's oil industry, which generated enormous profit but which returned only a small fraction of wealth back to Iran. In response, the British attempted to impose an embargo and blockade of Iran and lodged complaints against Iran before the United Nations Security Council. The British government threatened legal action against purchasers of oil produced by Iranian refineries. And in secret, MI6, the British intelligence service, plotted to remove Mossadegh from power. But the British lacked hard power. They simply couldn't muster the economic or military or covert force necessary to directly hurt Iran. And so they turned to whom else but the United States. By 1952, the situation in Iran had deteriorated severely. Although the British embargo had weakened the economy, and though political divisions had deepened, Mossadegh was increasingly consolidating his power in an attempt to combat Western undermining of his efforts. And in this moment of relative weakness, the British and their American allies saw an opportunity. The very next year, in March of 1953, the CIA formally began its plot to overthrow Mossadegh. By early June of that year, the plan was ready. It was called Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax had three core objectives. The first was to remove Mossadegh. The second was to strengthen the position of the West's puppet leader, the Shah. And the third was to prevent any intrusions of influence by the Soviet Union. Use force to lock out enemy soft power. To that end, the CIA encouraged and outright bribed the Shah, one Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to issue a decree dismissing Mossadegh, which ultimately failed, forcing the Shah to flee to Italy. Despite that initial failure, the CIA tried again, this time by literally bribing protesters, creating fake mobs which were used to manufacture violence, forcing a violent response from the government which left hundreds dead. That sounds kind of familiar, right? This violent smokescreen was then utilized by CIA-backed pro-monarchy loyalists, led by retired Army General Fazlollah Zahedi, who stormed the capital, overwhelmed Mossadegh's troops, and eventually arrested him. The Shah was thereafter returned to power, and Zahedi was appointed Prime Minister. And the Shah and Zahedi did what any good Western puppet leaders should. They agreed to restore the flow of Iranian oil to world markets in substantial quantities. And in so doing, they gave control of Iranian oil over to the British and the Americans, changing the name of the old Anglo-Iranian oil company to none other than British Petroleum. That's right, BP, everyone's favorite catastrophic environmental disaster of a company, was founded on stolen Iranian oil. But in Iran, the decision was extremely unpopular. It was so unpopular that the new government feared being overthrown itself. So under pressure from the United States, BP accepted membership in a consortium of oil companies which would work together to bring Iranian oil back into the market. This consortium coalesced in the form of a holding company called Iranian Oil Participants Ltd, or IOP. And the founding members of the IOP included British Petroleum, Gulf Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, Total Energies, Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, and Texaco. The West would have its pound of flesh and extract Iran's wealth for itself, while obfuscating the exploitation as much as it could. But from the outside, all of this looks like soft power, doesn't it? Consider the narrative a Western media consumer might encounter. A popular demagogue seizes power from our noble ally, the Shah of Iran. And this usurper immediately tries to take the oil wealth for himself. But his decision hurts his country so much that his people rise up and the dictator kills a bunch of innocent protesters, and so the people overthrow him and they reappoint our friend the Shah and reinstate their democratic system. Now, finally, the women are free and the children can breathe easy. The Iranian people love freedom and democracy, and free trade is what is fed to the outside world. But the internal mechanisms that fueled the coup from the top down were hard power interventions pursued for Western control over Iran's natural resources against the will of the Iranian people. And because the soft power pro-Western stability of Iran was built on but an illusion produced by hard power, when the United States blinked and turned its hard power head away for but a moment, the system it had carefully constructed began to unravel. In the years following the 1953 coup, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whose dynasty remains an asset of U.S. intelligence, by the way, consolidated his power with the backing of the U.S. and the UK. Political opposition was suppressed and the regime turned to its own intelligence apparatus, the infamous secret police organization Savak, to monitor and silence dissenters.
Are you aware of a CIA psychological profile about you, sir?
No, I must admit that it's the first time I hear that.
Truly?
Yes. What is it?
Would you be interested in hearing what the CIA had to say?
Yes, why not?
Really?
Yes, why not?
I have your permission?
Yes, sure.
You won't send me to the Savak if I ask?
No, I would spare you this terrible ordeal of going through torture.
This secret study portrays the Shah as a brilliant but dangerous megalomaniac who is likely to pursue his own aims in disregard of U.S. interests.
So how could I be your man, your agent?
The Shah also undertook a massive westernization effort known as the White Revolution. The goal of the White Revolution was simple. The peasants and working class were getting crushed under the corrupt system as it existed, and alleviating some pressure through land reform without substantially improving their conditions or bargaining power might ease their frustrations enough to stave off a communist revolution. It was meant to be a revolution without blood, hence the White Revolution. But genuine revolutionary change cannot come from above, and the Shah's revolution was not aligned with the interests of the people. Sure, the White Revolution substantially improved literacy rates, it expanded women's rights, improved essential infrastructure, and grew the economy. But the economic growth was fundamentally uneven. Oil wealth became concentrated once again in the hands of the few, and often the foreign. Urban elites who supported this liberal economic system reaped the profits, while most others suffered its consequences. As Ervand Abrahamian, distinguished professor of history at Baruch College, states, the White Revolution had been designed to preempt a Red Revolution. Instead, it paved the way for an Islamic Revolution. This anger culminated in a revolutionary figurehead emerging in the form of Ayatollah Khomeini, a Twelver Shia cleric, who voiced his dissent at the Shah in 1963 by declaring him, and I quote, a wretched, miserable man who embarked on the path toward destruction of Islam in Iran. The Shah, in response, knowing that Khomeini couldn't just be assassinated for fear of revolution, arrested him instead. Yet even just the act of arrest, however, caused 3 days of riots to follow in which as many as 15,000 protesters were killed as a result of police aggression. After 8 months of house arrest, Khomeini was freed and he continued his agitation, only to be rearrested and exiled in November of 1964 to Bursa, Turkey. What followed was a period of apparent relative calm. Oil wealth grew, and from the outside, Iran appeared both modern and prosperous. Have you ever seen those comparison photos of Iranian women before and after the Islamic Revolution? While Western clothes and values, the apparent results of soft power, were backed by and enforced through exceptionally unpopular American hard power. There was massive economic inequality, very limited political participation, and Savak, the secret police backed by American intelligence, continued to brutally silence opposition. The surface once again looks like an American cultural victory, but that cultural victory is only a veneer atop an ongoing economic, intelligence, and military operation. The facade was quite amenable to Western observers. Only the very few and very wealthy reaped those benefits while everyone else toiled to support their lifestyles. Those people didn't matter to the Shah because they had no wealth and no power. Look, for the Shah, for his pro-Western regime, an uneducated populace is simply easier to rule. The wealthy get to act like Westerners and get education. They get the benefits of foreign exploitation of their countrymen. But the normal people receive no benefit. There's a reason why the Islamic Republic still exists and enjoys substantial legitimacy in Iran despite Western narratives to the contrary. There's also a reason why the Iranian diaspora in the West tends to be so anti-Islamic Republic. Their families were the wealthy pro-Western families. If you are interested in learning more about the Islamic Republic of Iran, by the way, I highly recommend former British diplomat Alistair Crook's book, Resistance: The Essence of Islamic Revolution. In any case, the oppression and inequality reached a breaking point in the late 70s when a series of mysterious deaths amongst leading outspoken Islamist figures in Iran led to protests. As the protests then grew out of control, the Shah attempted to negotiate with the protesters, promising full democratic elections, relaxed censorship, and reduced corruption. But the Iranian people had already experienced the White Revolution. They understood that meaningful change cannot come from the top down, because the powerful will always be primarily self-interested, and not be willing to concede as much as the people require to survive. Thus, protests continued and were violently quashed until the population could take no more. In 1987, nationwide strikes shut down the production of the Iranian oil industry, and by late October of that year, a general strike was declared. The Shah was paralyzed. If he shut down the protests, they would emerge in greater force. If he left them alone, they would continue to grow as well. The military leadership followed along with the Shah's indecision, and so when Khomeini called for the military to defect, deserters abandoned the military in droves. By December of 1978, the situation in Iran had become so untenable that the Carter administration considered pulling its support of the Shah, developing a plan instead to create a sort of pro-Western military junta, with Khomeini installed as a puppeted spiritual leader. But officials in the Carter administration also disagreed with each other, and thus no decision was finally reached. On January 16, 1979, the Shah and his family fled to Egypt, even as American General Robert Heusser, the deputy commander of U.S. European Command, entered Iran to discuss the possibility of a pro-Shah coup with Iran's military leaders. But that never came to fruition. With the Shah officially out, two rival governments established themselves. The first was the government of Shapur Bakhtiar, who was chosen specifically by the Shah to help in the creation of a civilian government. And then there was the revolutionary government of Ayatollah Khomeini. By February of that same year, however, it had become clear that Bakhtiar's government lacked the support of the people. And by February 11th, the Ayatollah's rebel forces, supported by Islamist Marxist guerrillas, had overthrown the provisional civil government, which in turn marks the founding of the Islamic Republic of Iran. If soft power had been enough on its own to secure the loyalty of Iran, if short dresses and blue jeans, if rock music and fast food, if the trappings of consumerism had been sufficient by their own merits, then there wouldn't have been a revolution the second the Americans dropped their guard. In truth, the trappings of American soft power, as we have seen, as we will continue to see, and as we are observing in the present, were and are held together by extraordinary repression and gratuitous use of hard power. But there is one more weapon in the American hard power arsenal that we must discuss, and it is arguably the most sinister of all for both its ease of use and its deadliness. I am referring to the single American weapon which has killed more people than any other: the economic sanction.
As I said to you before, I think that we are an incredibly ruthless country. The amount of murder and mayhem that we've created around the world is just unbelievable. You know, I was looking at a study the other day put out by Lancet, which is a scientific journal, and they did a study. This was put out, you can see it on the internet. It was put out in November of 2025. And what the article did was it looked at sanctions, American sanctions, from 1971 to 2021, 1971 to 2021. And it asked what were the consequences of those sanctions. And we murdered 38 million people. 38 million people.
We in the West, for whatever reason, are obsessed with numbers of death and casualties in wars and atrocities. I once had a good Jewish friend of mine teach me this important lesson. Deaths by war, by genocide, by famine, these things are counted in numbers, but they're not meant to be compared in numbers. It's not a contest, it's not a race. All of it, all of these atrocities, are terrible. But in the typical Western mindset, we kind of consider some forms of genocide and atrocity worse than others, don't we? The Holocaust needs no introduction. Around 17 million people were killed by Nazi Germany. In the West, we look at the deaths of the Great Leap Forward, wherein China attempted to combat a history of terrible famine, and we tend to blame every single element of that transitionary period on the singular policies of Mao Zedong, tallying up 35 million deaths to his name. And yet, when we in the West impose famine on others, not trying to fix old problems but to purposefully create new ones, we suddenly don't care enough to count. And when others count for us, well, we consider the price they pay in their blood worth it.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice but we think the price is worth it.
We think the price was worth it. That was Madeleine Albright, who served as Secretary of State under President Bill Clinton, speaking during an interview in 1996 on the matter of sanctions, while she was still serving as the American ambassador to the United Nations. 500,000 dead Iraqi children. To do what? To end the regime of Saddam Hussein and to prevent his development of so-called weapons of mass destruction? The same regime we put into power in the first place, and the same regime we ended up toppling by force of arms a decade later in an alleged search for those same weapons which were never found. We killed multiple nuclear detonations worth of people in Iraq, literally starving them to death, only to invade anyway and cause an additional million in excess deaths. And to Madeleine Albright, to Bill Clinton, to our Western allies in the United Nations, the price of achieving absolutely nothing was worth millions of Iraqi dead. Because in their inhumane and monstrous calculus, those Iraqi men, women, and children are worth nothing, and 0 minus 0 is 0. 500,000 may as well have been 5 million, may as well have been 5 billion. The number of dead doesn't matter to them. What matters to them is the primacy of American hard power, the dominance of the American hegemony no matter the cost. Now, when we think of the economic sanction, we often think it works something like this. Let's say you're North Korea. You're a communist country, which we think is wrong, and you're threatening our ally, South Korea. Thus, to punish your behavior, we will prohibit Americans, American companies, American banks, and anyone inside of U.S. jurisdiction from doing business with you. This is called a primary sanction. But sanctions often go much further. You can also say anyone who trades with you will also not be able to trade with us. And because everyone wants to trade with us, nobody trades with you, and thus you are economically squeezed to death. This is called a secondary sanction, and it's possible because of just how integral the United States is to the global economy by design. On July 1st, 1944, a gathering of 730 delegates from all 44 nations of the Allies met at Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to discuss the post-war international monetary and financial order. The global economy was thought to be partially responsible for both world wars, you see, and thus an organized international economic order could hopefully lead to a rising tide that lifts all boats. And on July 22nd, the Allies walked away with a few major agreements in place. The first agreement was the creation of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, which was meant to monitor exchange rates and lend money to nations with economic problems. The second agreement then after the IMF was the creation of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, which later became the foundation for what we call the World Bank. With most of Europe and Asia having been ravaged by war, the IBRD was supposed to help finance the rebuilding effort and eventually also assist in the development of poorer countries. When the IBRD comes with development money, though, who decides what gets built? Who decides what economic model gets put in place and what kind of society gets encouraged? Well, the Americans do, and to top it all off, if you want to join the IBRD, you are also required to join the IMF. And this gets tied together by the third major agreement of Bretton Woods, the Final Act, which built the entire global economy around the US dollar. Member countries had to peg their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to the price of gold at $35 per ounce. So let's say that your currency is the Hylian rupee, and you have 4 Hylian rupees that equals $1. If your currency rises too much in value, the central bank of Hyrule can sell its own currency to buy dollars to push the value of the rupee back down. You will note then that while the rules as written allowed America vast amounts of control over the global economy, there was still a check in place. As long as the dollar was tied to gold, the United States couldn't just create infinite dollars without consequences. If the United States prints too many dollars and foreign governments come a-knocking to swap their dollars out for gold, you have to have enough gold to swap, or the faith in the dollar collapses and with it, the global economy. You can kind of imagine what happened next then. When the checks became inconvenient, the United States simply ignored them. The Vietnam War, you see, had become prohibitively expensive, and with so many dollars circulating, the world began to wonder if the US really had enough gold to cover its currency. In response to those concerns, then, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the U.S. would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold, and then issued a 10% surcharge on imports, in other words, a tariff, an event known as the Nixon shock. The U.S. economy boomed in response and the global economy shrank. Now, the U.S. dollar was at the center of global finance without any checks and apparently without any substantial blowback or consequences. The U.S. was simply too powerful militarily and economically. And we all live in the reality of that decision in the post-Bretton Woods financial system. With the dollar and thus currencies around the world no longer tied to gold, exchange rates began to float freely, and in that environment, finance became much more important. Currencies move, and thus interest rates move, and thus capital moves. And where capital moves, profits can be made. Think of it like this. Where does a nation's economic power come from? Well, traditionally one might say the workers, the peasant farming the land, or the laborer in the factory. Maybe also through trade. What the worker produces can be bought and sold, where that good is scarce, fulfilling the dynamics of supply and demand. But in a financialized system, economic power becomes primarily exercised through instruments like bonds or loans or securities. Which is to say, your economic power comes from the manipulation of money and not the production and distribution of goods. Put another way, you don't need to work in the factory if you own shares in the company that owns the factory, or if you own the debt of the company that owns the factory. You don't need to ship the goods if you finance the shipment, if you insure the cargo vessel, if you process the payment or underwrite the loan. In a financialized world, then, a country cannot simply produce its way out of every problem. It needs access to the financial machinery upon which the global economy is designed to function. You can have oil, but if nobody can buy your oil, nobody can ship your oil, nobody can insure your ships, and nobody's willing to handle the payment transaction for the sale, then the economic power of having even a valuable resource like oil is greatly diminished. You might see where this is going then. Let's say you're in, Brazil, and you want to buy a rare book from Malaysia. The book never crosses into American territory, but it's very likely that the payment is denominated in US dollars as opposed to reais or ringgit. You trigger your bank then to send $100 to the Malaysian seller, but your Brazilian bank cannot just create USD out of thin air. Instead, it holds a dollar account with a larger bank that has access to the US banking system, and the Malaysian bank likewise does something similar. To complete the payment then, the banks exchange instructions and adjust balances between their dollar accounts in a process known as dollar clearing. And once your transaction touches upon the American financial system, the US has leverage over you and your transaction. Consider OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which administers and enforces many of America's sanctions. If OFAC places a person or a company or a bank on its sanctions list, broadly speaking, Americans can't do business with them and their property in the US can be frozen. But what can also happen is other institutions like banks who don't want to lose access to dollar clearing or pay massive fines for violating sanctions rules will also decide that compliance risk isn't worth it, and thus refuse to process transactions related to the sanctioned entity. So imagine the same scenario, but one party is sanctioned. Even if the sanction doesn't touch upon your transaction, even if America isn't directly involved, by proxy of coercive force, the banks may be too afraid to process your transaction. In other words, if you don't please America, your entire economy struggles to buy and sell stuff. America makes you financially radioactive, deadly to even interact with. I know this is a lot to take in. This section was originally both twice as long and totally cut at different points, but I felt the context was too important. There's a lot more we could discuss here, from the petrodollar to offshore euro-dollar banking to SWIFT to Fed swap lines, but this isn't economics explained. Ultimately, we only need enough context to digest how powerful sanctions actually are as weapons. To observe how sanctions work as hard power then, and how soft power fails when hard power fails in this circumstance, let's narrow our scope to a specific case study by returning to the nation of Cuba.
Cuando las tropas surafricanas avanzaban a 70 kilómetros por día desde Namibia.
On December 10, 1898, the United States and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, wherein, amongst other concessions, Spain renounced all rights to Cuba, thus ending the Spanish-American War. The United States, however, was not about to let Cuba just walk free, despite ostensibly fighting the war in part for Cuban independence. Cuba was placed under American military rule, which would only be lifted in 1902, after Cuba agreed to the 8 provisions of the Platt Amendment. Cuba surrendered its military, diplomatic, territorial, and financial sovereignty and agreed that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Cuban politics at any time for the quote-unquote maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. By 1926, just 25 years after the Platt Amendment, U.S. companies owned 60% of the Cuban sugar industry, and the U.S. imported 95% of that Cuban crop. The arrangement had predictable consequences. Cuba's economy was heavily dependent on a single export, which is to say sugar, and that export was controlled in large part by exclusively American interests. And this economic imbalance was maintained by a corrupt American-backed government, which in turn was deeply unpopular amongst its people. This in turn led to the government of Gerardo Machado being overthrown by a genuine popular revolt. A US-backed provisional government was hastily put in place, but that quickly fell apart, and Machado's first legitimate replacement, Ramon Grau, immediately nullified the Platt Amendment upon assuming the presidency. In a panicked response, U.S. Ambassador to Cuba Sumner Welles requested U.S. military intervention, and President Franklin Delano Good Neighbor Policy Roosevelt himself ordered 29 warships to Cuba, alerted the Marines, and prepared bombers. The intervention, however, proved unnecessary. The message had been sent, and Grau's government, starved of recognition, was vulnerable. The United States tapped the head of the military, one Fulgencio Batista, and together they forced Grau to resign, replacing Grau with a puppet president, Carlos Mendieta, with Batista in the shadows as the true ruler of Cuba and the United States standing behind him. Batista ruled Cuba from the 30s until the early 50s. The Batista era saw Cuba's economy come under nearly complete American control, with corruption rife in government and with Havana becoming notorious as a den for American organized crime. As U.S. Ambassador to Cuba Arthur Gardner puts it, and I quote, "Batista had always leaned towards the United States. I don't think we ever had a better friend. It was regrettable, like all South Americans, that he was known to be getting a cut, I think is the word for it, in almost all the things that were done. But, on the other hand, he was doing an amazing job." This so-called amazing job came to an end when the Cuban people could finally take no more of Batista's corruption and America's extraction. In July of 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro led a group of revolutionaries on a failed attack against the Batista government. Castro was taken prisoner and the revolution appeared to fail, but the anger of the Cuban people was only building pressure. In hopes of alleviating some of that pressure, in 1955, Batista released many of his captured political prisoners in an act of amnesty, backed by the United States and major corporations. And to make a long story short, this culminated in a genuine successful revolution, with Castro and his forces overthrowing Batista on January 1st, 1959. The United States attempted to first make good with this new Cuban administration, hoping that it could win over the administration with its original tricks, with bribery and corruption. But Castro's government, organized around genuine revolutionary principles, morals, and values that extended beyond mere capital accumulation, failed to concede to American interests. In their hearts, there was something greater than mere wealth accumulation. Cuba began to implement agrarian reforms and nationalized many of the industries once owned by American interests. And as Cuba unshackled itself from American exploitation, the Americans grew displeased. The U.S. then imposed its first economic sanctions on Cuba, hoping to injure growing Cuban sovereignty. First, the U.S. canceled the sugar quota. Sugar was Cuba's primary export, you see, and the U.S. was its main buyer. Without sugar exports, the U.S. thought, the Cuban economy would collapse and a new revolution would rise up to overthrow Castro's government. These initial sanctions were followed by export restrictions. All exports from the U.S. to Cuba were banned save for food and medicine. Cuba would no longer have the tools of industry necessary to build a country. Just like with the Megarian Decree, however, these sanctions backfired, and the Cubans responded by nationalizing even more formerly U.S.-owned businesses, while also expanding their ties with the Soviet Union, which in turn led to the full U.S. embargo of Cuba, which began in 1962, not long after the CIA attempted Bay of Pigs invasion. All trade with Cuba was banned, with imports and exports completely cut off. Cuba was also cut off from the global financial system. The U.S. then mobilized its hard power squeeze to push its allies to follow its sanctions, turning Cuba into a regional trade pariah as well. And long after the Cold War ended, to this very day, Cuba continues to be under withering sanctions which deprive the island nation of fuel, natural resources, and access to global markets. In 2023, the United Nations estimated that the total economic damage to the Cuban economy was in the trillions of dollars since the inception of the embargo. Despite these long decades of sustained economic pressure, despite the American-imposed economic dysfunction, however, Cuba has been able to persevere. Cuba has, for example, with its limited resources, been able to invest heavily into biotechnology and pharmaceutical research, developing pioneering vaccines and cancer treatments domestically. Consider this. In 2015, Cuba became the first country in the world to eliminate mother-to-child transmission of HIV and syphilis, as validated by the World Health Organization. Cuba demonstrates to us how the reach of soft power is limited by the reach of hard power. Where hard power could not produce compliance, not through intervention, nor military invasion, nor economic coercion, soft power also failed to gain a foothold. Soft power does exist, as we stated, but in this case it exists largely within hard power boundaries and geopolitical realities. What about, however, situations in which economic coercion does succeed because the hard power fundamentals are in place? Consider Japan in the 1980s. In 1985, the US pressured Japan, West Germany, France, and the UK into agreeing to push the value of the dollar down against their currencies, including the yen, thereby making American exports more competitive. For Japan in particular, this was a terrible deal, but the Japanese could not refuse, as failing to agree would result in trade war with the United States. The yen appreciated dramatically, Japanese exporters came under pressure, and the Japanese response inflated an asset bubble, the collapse of which led into the lost decades, which persists, by the way, to this very day. The dollar giveth, and the dollar taketh away. Cuba shows us what happens when economic coercion fails against an enemy outside of the American order. Japan shows us what happens when economic coercion succeeds against an ally inside of it. But both examples point us back to the same place. American economic power is strongest where American military and political power have already structured the field, and American soft power arrives downstream of them all. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's return to the most visible form of hard power, in military intervention. What are the consequences? What happens to soft power when military intervention itself finally fails?
You know, there's lots of things you expect in war. Carnage, the sleepless nights. But what they don't prepare you for is the incessant use of Fortunate Son.
Vietnam is often remembered as the moment when American media finally turned against state narratives, when the great moral awakening of journalism occurred. In this version of events, the outcome of the war serves as proof of the free press's ideological superiority, that liberal media possesses an internal corrective which over time favors exposure and not enforced consensus. And this interpretation is frequently invoked by neoliberal institutionalists who point to Vietnam as a demonstration of legitimacy succeeding over coercion, of open societies exposing their own failures and surviving while authoritarian systems collapse under the weight of enforced narrative. The American dream survived the failure of Vietnam, but the Soviets didn't survive Afghanistan, right? This is proof that our system works. But let's hold on a moment and observe the Vietnam War more closely. By the early 1960s, anti-communism was the organizing force of American political legitimacy. There was McCarthyism, the Red Scare, which treated communist thought as a virus that could infect your co-workers, friends, and loved ones with anti-Americanism. A person could have their reputation torpedoed, their careers ruined, not even necessarily for being communists, but for not being anti-communist enough. Nobody needed to be instructed to frame communist expansion as a threat, nor did editors require pressure to portray American intervention as defensive in nature. As we discussed, the incentives were already in place, and the audience had already been conditioned through generations of political myth-making and institutional reinforcement to understand that America and its professed values were exceptional and morally sacrosanct. And the Vietnam War was at first processed through that same framework. American involvement was framed as limited and advisory, even as the United States military geared up for war. The American puppet state of South Vietnam was portrayed as flawed but necessary, even as the deeply corrupt regime of Ngo Dinh Diem pursued repression and sectarian favoritism, which generated growing popular discontent. It's a familiar pattern to us now, isn't it? Escalation and American intervention seemed inevitable. Let's go back in time a little bit, right? When the Japanese invaded the colony of French Indochina during World War II, it exposed to the Vietnamese people that the French were not invincible. As a result, the Vietnamese anti-colonial movements arose, ready to unshackle the nation itself once and for all from the imperial ambitions of foreign powers. And of these movements, the most significant was a Marxist-Leninist anti-colonial movement led by one Ho Chi Minh. In 1945, Ho declared Vietnam independent of French rule. But France was not ready to give up her colonial possession. What followed was the First Indochina War, which ended in a decisive French defeat in 1954 and the subsequent Geneva Conference, which partitioned Vietnam into two separate entities at the 17th parallel: the independent communist North Vietnam and the pro-Western South Vietnam. The intention was, eventually, that nationwide elections would be held and the country would be reunified. Those elections never happened, though. The United States, newly emergent as the dominant Western power, viewed the ongoing war through its strategy for the Cold War, which is to say, containment. Communism, the strategy proposed, as we discussed, had to be prevented from expanding beyond its existing borders. Vietnam then was not important because of the territory of Vietnam per se, but because of what it represented, the first domino in what American policymakers came to call the domino theory. If Vietnam falls to communism, all of Southeast Asia might too, thereby undermining American credibility. American involvement in Vietnam crept in slowly. Familiar song and dance, right? First, in the 1950s, there was financial aid, military advisors, and political backing for the pro-Western government of South Vietnam.
At this time, however, the Americans in Vietnam are there only as advisors. There are no United States combat units as such.
By the early 1960s, so-called American military advisors had grown in number to the tens of thousands. And by the summer of 1964, American involvement in Vietnam had already grown to the point where conflict seemed inevitable. Even as the American public believed that U.S. troops were in Vietnam merely to keep the peace, the military had already shifted its planning from support to outright engagement. All that remained was a casus belli, a cause for war, capable of aligning public framing and strategic intentions. Thus, on August 2, 1964, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Maddox reported an engagement with North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, on August 4th, the Johnson administration announced that a second attack had occurred, this time both unprovoked and in international waters. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. The second attack, it turns out, never happened, by the way. Now, ostensibly, internal communications inside the government reflected some uncertainty. Radio signals were ambiguous, and sonar readings were inconsistent, and the weather was poor, and doubts emerged as to whether any attack had actually occurred at all. But the uncertainty didn't really matter. The war had already been decided on and declared well before the public was made aware of it or any vote was cast. On August 7th, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution with near unanimity, granting the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The resolution did not specify limits, objectives, or duration. It effectively outsourced Congress's constitutional war-making authority to the executive branch. Initial coverage treated the government's account as authoritative, with headlines echoing the official language, while editorials emphasized restraint while endorsing the response. The ambiguity of the evidence underlying the call to war was acknowledged, but as a matter of secondary concern. Despite the flimsy moral reasoning, around 59% of Americans were in favor of the war at its outset. American airstrikes began and then intensified. Troop deployments surged. The military-industrial complex was unshackled, operating at massive scale with a staggering indifference to human life. During World War II, the United States dropped a total of 2,150,000 tons of bombs in all theaters of the war. During the Vietnam War, around 7,662,000 tons of explosives were dropped. That's nearly 4 times the amount. Horrifying chemical weapons like Agent Orange were deployed, which obliterated the environment and caused devastating long-term effects to Vietnamese civilian populations in the form of cancers and birth defects. An extreme war of attrition was waged, with the assumption that American industrial might would eventually exhaust our primitive enemy. But the enemy refused to break, for while the Americans fought against communism, the Vietnamese were not fighting for communism. They were fighting for independence, for freedom. Freedom from France, freedom from Japan, and freedom from the United States. And as the costs mounted and escalation failed to produce resolution, the gap between the official framing and material reality widened beyond repair. The hard power failed first. On January 15, 1973, the United States suspended all combat activities in Vietnam. And on April 30, 1975, Vietnamese forces captured the capital of the pro-Western regime, marking the end of the Vietnam War. The United States had waged one of the most barbarous campaigns of war imaginable, committing innumerable war crimes against a people it had no business fighting, but for strategic goals of ideological containment that proved disconnected from local political realities. And it had achieved nothing. The war was immensely unpopular, with U.S. polling in 1978 revealing that 72% of Americans believed that the war was fundamentally immoral and wrong. The total cost of the war was nearly $2 trillion in today's dollars, and the legacy of the war continues to be felt even to this day in both Vietnam and here in the United States. Back at home, there were protests, and media coverage reflected the eroding of public trust. Faith in the government was fractured. The moral authority of the American state was openly questioned. As Secretary of Defense McNamara once wrote to President Johnson, the picture of the world's greatest superpower killing or seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week while trying to pound a tiny backward nation into submission on an issue whose merits are hotly disputed is not a pretty one. Now there's this prevailing narrative in the United States that it is this unpretty image, it is the home front, that sank the war front. If the public hadn't been such pansies, we'd have eventually bowled over the North Vietnamese and won the war. But in Vietnam, like in Iran, like in Cuba, we see how soft power does not operate independently of hard power, but emerges instead downstream of it, contingent on the successful establishment of political order through hard power. The home front was lost because the war front was lost. The public opinion shifted because we failed in our hard power deployment. The failure of our hard power produced failure in our influence at home and weakening of it abroad. Consider, though, at the same time how our hard power was affecting other places around the world. Hard power during the Cold War remained decisive in Europe and Japan and Korea and other places where material reconstruction and security guarantees and institutional integration produced regimes that could be normalized and eventually internalized by their local populations, all of which came only after the successful application of hard power. Vietnam lacked those conditions. No amount of media coordination or cultural messaging could manufacture legitimacy for a regime that its own population experienced as imposed and corrupt. Where force did not succeed, neither thereafter could influence. The outcome of the Vietnam War reveals to us that without successful hard power, once again, the American model of soft power simply cannot follow. What then was the takeaway in Washington from this whole debacle? Well, I'll tell you what, it wasn't give peace a chance. It wasn't, well, maybe if we improve the material conditions of people, our system will look more enticing. No, the hegemonic superpower did what hegemonic superpowers always do. It sought new ways to use hard power to maintain its hegemony. The Vietnam War formally ended in 1975, and for a short time thereafter, the United States shied away from foreign conflict. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which ostensibly prohibited the president from unilaterally sending the U.S. armed forces into action without Congress's statutory authorization, or in the case of a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. But remember that soft power is held together by hard power. And if America wanted to maintain its soft powers, the interventions could not stop. We saw what happened in Cuba, Iran, and now Vietnam. When American hard power flinches, its soft power collapses. So America started to lean away from the use of outright military invasion and leaned harder on the other two elements of hard power: economic coercion and clandestine operation. Consider this. From the moment the United States articulated the Monroe Doctrine, Central America had been treated less like a foreign territory and more like a special economic zone, a region where American power was presumed legitimate by default. There was the big stick policy and dollar diplomacy. And that's not imperialism. We're there to maintain order, right? By the late 1970s and 80s, however, the discontent of Central American peoples over their US-backed corrupt dictatorships boiled over into revolution. You will recall, for example, that the United States occupied Nicaragua from 1912 to 1933 during the Banana Wars. Well, after the occupation period, the United States installed a hereditary military dictatorship led by the Somoza family as a pro-American puppet government. Under the rule of the Somoza family, Nicaragua was faced with rising inequality and political corruption, and a government that prioritized the interests of American multinational corporations over those of its own people. Nothing new there, right? In the early 1980s, this outrage culminated in the Sandinista National Liberation Front, one of a handful of different leftist insurgencies that arose to challenge American-backed dictators throughout Central America. To American policymakers steeped in the rhetoric of the Cold War, this was intolerable, not because Nicaragua posed any kind of military threat, but because the revolution threatened American credibility. Not soft power credibility, but hard power credibility. A large-scale invasion, however, was politically impossible after Vietnam. An open-ended war would provoke backlash. And Congress, reflecting public exhaustion, explicitly prohibited funding for efforts to overthrow the Nicaraguan government through a series of restrictions called the Boland Amendment. But the president at the time, none other than Ronald Wilson Reagan, remained committed to defeating the Sandinistas and preserving the image of American hemispheric hegemony. With the law so against him, however, and the public so extremely united against further interventions in wars, well, Ronald Reagan had no choice. He just gave up and attempted to diplomatically. No, of course not. Reagan simply circumvented the law and ignored public opinion to exercise American hard power. The Reagan administration funded, trained, and provided weapons to counter-revolutionary, or Contra, militias fighting against the Sandinista government. But where would they get these funds? Congress would never approve of this, right? Well, with the assistance of the CIA, the Reagan administration secretly approved the sale of American weapons to our old friend, Iran. a country that on paper was officially an enemy of the United States and which was subject to an arms embargo. Now, the plan was simple. The CIA would secretly and unlawfully sell American weapons to Iran using the smokescreen of trying to free American hostages in Lebanon. They would then use that money to fund the Contras. It was foolproof. We would leverage our economic coercion using our intelligence apparatus and exercise our hard power without having to put boots on the ground. So Ronald Reagan sold weapons to a hostile state, violated America's own embargoes in the process, laundered the money, then used it to finance a war that nobody wanted and that Congress had expressly forbidden. This fiasco became known as the Iran-Contra affair. The operation was exposed in 1986 to much public outrage. Investigations were launched and General Oliver North was thrown under the bus, indicted, and then subsequently acquitted. The whole thing was framed as a scandal, a rogue operation by General North. But everyone got off scot-free. The plan had worked. What the Iran-Contra affair proved was that you could use hard power without any form of legitimacy whatsoever, so long as intervention remained plausibly deniable and was shielded from sustained public scrutiny. It could continue even in direct violation of the law. Intervention was a necessary element of American hegemony, and thus the use of hard power sat de facto above the law, above Congress, and above the people. Iran-Contra then, far from being an aberration, far from being a scandal, became a prototype for American intervention for the decades to come. Consider, for example, Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in history. Through the CIA, and primarily by proxy via the Pakistani intelligence service, the United States funneled weapons, funding, and training to Afghan insurgent groups fighting the Soviet Union. Ayatollahs in Iran, Russians in Afghanistan, right? In the Soviet-Afghan War, no American troops were deployed, no war was declared, no congressional authorization was sought. The war was fought by proxies and largely invisible to the American public. Instead, the public was fed a narrative of brave Mujahideen fighters standing up against Soviet aggression. The very same brave Mujahideen fighters, it turns out, didn't exactly appreciate America either, but that comes later. Over the course of the 80s, the Soviet Union was drawn into a grinding asymmetric conflict that drained its resources and eroded its national morale. In 1989, Soviet forces withdrew in an embarrassing defeat, and just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. This outcome is often narrated as a failure of Soviet legitimacy, of the USSR losing the confidence of its people and crumbling under its own contradictions. But note the order of operations, right? The Soviet Union didn't lose legitimacy first and then suffer defeat. It suffered sustained material pressure, military exhaustion, economic collapse, and then legitimacy failure came afterwards. The soft power here could not survive without the hard power backing it up. And that hard power includes military and economy. Operation Cyclone then seemed to represent a successful resolution of the Vietnam problem. The United States had learned how to bleed an enemy while keeping political costs at length, or so it thought. But as the 1980s ended, the world changed yet again. The Soviet bloc was collapsing and the Cold War order was coming apart. The United States was already the leader of the free world, and with no other world but the free world, why, the US was de facto king of the world. And under those conditions, hard power no longer needed to be so subtle. Which begs the question, how will the United States behave in a world without rivals, where its dollar is God and its word is law? It was in Panama, then, that the United States saw an opportunity and an answer. You see, since the construction of the Panama Canal in the early 1900s, the country, like much of Central America, but even more so, functioned less like a sovereign state and more like a logistical artery of U.S. global dominance. The CIA maintained deep ties with Panamanian leadership, including one Manuel Noriega, a, you guessed it, military strongman who had long cooperated with the U.S. as an asset. When Noriega ceased his compliance, though, and began asserting autonomy and threatening canal security, President George H.W. Bush launched Operation Just Cause in December of 1989. Now you know where the video game's name comes from. In any case, more than 27,000 troops were deployed in an invasion of Panama. The Panamanian Defense Forces collapsed within days, and Noriega was captured, transported to the United States, tried, and imprisoned. The entire operation lasted mere weeks. And as a result, there was no legitimacy crisis at home, no draft, no prolonged occupation, no troubles. Media coverage framed the invasion as mere law enforcement rather than war. A police action to restore order, protect democracy, and uphold international norms. Moving forward, America was to be the global police, and our military, our sanctions, our intelligence were medicine for a sick world. The great game was over, and America was the winner. In 1989, a few months prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall and Operation Just Cause, political scientist and international relations scholar Francis Fukuyama published an essay arguing that with the final defeat of fascism and communism, there was no longer any serious competition for liberal democracy in the market economy. In the realm of ideas, said Fukuyama, liberalism had won, and since there were no longer any competitors, it was only a matter of time before liberal democracy and market economies spread throughout the world. What remains of history will be peaceful, boring even, Pax Americana, the great and final age where the only puzzles left to solve are those of, quote, economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. In hindsight, well, this all seems to be pretty quaint, doesn't it? But at the time, people genuinely believed this to be true. As hard as it is for many of my younger viewers to imagine, in the 90s, people by and large genuinely believed that the world was getting better day by day, and that a brighter future was on its way for all of humanity. America just needed to keep things stable, to keep the bad actors in line and protect the status quo. In 1990, for example, following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the United States assembled a broad international coalition and launched the Gulf War. The war was swift, it was effective, it was decisive, and it was very one-sided. In a matter of weeks, Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait and American casualties were minimal. The war had a clear objective and a satisfying conclusion. No single country on earth could challenge the liberal democratic free market American system, or it would meet the same fate as Iraq. And throughout the 90s, the United States continued to intervene, always for the stated intention of protecting democracy and international norms. History's great ideological struggles truly appeared over, and all that remained was management. But the cracks were already there. The system had not, in fact, eliminated conflict, nor had it resolved its internal contradictions. And the United States, in its position of unchallenged dominance, imagined itself invincible and unassailable. If you watched my videos in the past, you know that I am a native New Yorker. I was here on September 11th, 2001. I remember the events of that day vividly. I remember the panic in people's faces, the fear of my own family, and the quiet relief that everyone was okay. I remember the scent of the chalky ash that coated every building, every car, everything. That sweet, sickly smell. And I remember the emotions of that day, the horror, followed by astonishment, then sorrow, then anger. And the feelings kept flashing back and forth until only anger remained. We must do something to prevent this from ever happening again. We must strike back. The desire to fight back is only natural when your world, once peaceful, is shaken by violence to its very core. And thus, whenever we Americans or one of our allies bombs innocent civilians, which in turn causes the rise of violent resistance groups, I, ironically perhaps, remember 9/11 and my own sorrow, confusion, and anger. In a twisted way, that's kind of what Osama bin Laden wanted all along. He wanted in part for Americans to experience what we'd been putting others through for 2 centuries. He wanted us to suffer as the world has suffered at our hands. But what we Americans took away from 9/11 was not stop bombing civilians because look how it feels. It was now more than ever we must be as American as possible. In that wave of extreme nationalism manifested itself in new wars of foreign aggression against a new and ultimately insurmountable enemy. Not Osama bin Laden, not his home base of Afghanistan, and not his sponsors in Saudi Arabia, but the nebulous concept of terror. In October of 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan, targeting bin Laden's Al-Qaeda and the Taliban government that harbored them. At first, the war appeared to go well. The Taliban government quickly fell, Allied forces captured the city of Kabul by November. The last city under Taliban control, Kandahar, fell on December 9th. But bin Laden was nowhere to be found, and it was thought that he might be hiding in the mountainous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, in one of the many caves of the Tora Bora mountain range. And as the conflict dragged on, the priorities began to shift as American hard power failed to bring about the expected results. The war started with the goal of dismantling Al-Qaeda and bringing bin Laden to justice. It evolved then into stabilizing Afghanistan, and from there to rebuilding Afghanistan in an American model and then protecting that new Afghan government from collapse. But, as many of you likely lived through, the American empire was not satisfied with a petty victory in Afghanistan. Let's return to the Gulf War for a moment. After the liberation of Kuwait, the US declared that its objectives had been achieved and that the war was a success. What the US did not do, however, was invade the capital of Iraq, Baghdad, and remove its leader, Saddam Hussein. Instead, the US tried to get the Iraqi people to remove Saddam Hussein, in part through clandestine operations, but also through vicious sanctions, no-fly zones, and periodic airstrikes. Despite all of that, though, Saddam Hussein remained stubbornly in power. By the late 90s, frustration with the status quo was growing inside of Washington. For example, the Project for the New American Century, we'll call it PNAC, a neoconservative think tank based in D.C., wrote an open letter in 1998 to then-President Bill Clinton, calling for the removal of Saddam Hussein by military force. This letter was signed by such notable neoconservatives as Robert Kagan, Elliott Abrams, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, and John Bolton. And, rather notably, Francis Fukuyama, Mr. End of History himself, making sure that history stays ended. PNAC had also previously released a statement of principles which described the US as the world's preeminent power and stated that the US must shape a new century favorable to American principles and interests by increasing defense spending and promoting political and economic freedom abroad. This statement was signed by all of the aforementioned neocons, but also figures like Dick Cheney, Scooter Libby, Jeb Bush, and surprise, surprise, Francis Fukuyama again. Which sort of goes to show you that even the foremost proponents of American soft power didn't really believe in it, that there was always a sort of underlying understanding that soft power needs a nudge, that it cannot stand alone. And soft power was failing massively in Iraq, even with all the economic and clandestine hard power pressure. In 2002 then, with Afghanistan having reached a stalemate, the administration of George W. Bush, whose cabinet appointees like Pearl, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, and Cheney, all of whom emerged out of PNAC, made the case that to win the war on terror, a preemptive strike against Iraq was necessary. In January of that year, President Bush called Iraq, as part of his State of the Union address, part of an axis of evil, alongside Iran, which was blindsided by this declaration as an enemy of Iraq. Oh, and there was North Korea as well. Just thrown in there for good measure. What exactly unites the three of these entities into an axis of evil? Well, absolutely nothing, but in the American logic this makes total sense. The evil that unites Iraq, Iran, and North Korea isn't a military alliance or economic support. It's a rejection of the American world order. And to oppose America, to oppose God's chosen country, the exceptional, the city on the hill, is to be evil. And so, by September of 2002, the administration concluded that Iraq was in possession of weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein, as an irrational dictator, could use at any time. Why Iraq was even reconstituting its nuclear program. They may have been just a week away from a nuclear weapon. On February 5, 2003, then, Colin Powell addressed the United Nations Security Council. He presented satellite images and intercepted communications and diagrams of alleged weapons facilities. And on March 20th, 2003, the United States launched a surprise military invasion of Iraq without a declaration of war under the codename Operation Iraqi Freedom, supported by a coalition of the willing consisting of 40 other governments. By April of 2003, Baghdad had fallen and Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. Coalition forces poured into the country, scouring it for the hidden weapons of mass destruction, only to find that there weren't any to begin with. No stockpiles of chemical weapons, no active nuclear program, nothing. The United States had torn apart Iraq for nothing, or so it seemed. But remember, the weapons of mass destruction were only the smokescreen. Heck, even the oil prize was only a secondary condition, although I'm sure Dick Cheney was quite happy about it. The primary consideration was the maintenance of American hegemony, of making a point to North Korea and Iran that they could either conform to the American world order or die. That is not soft power in action. The only task that remained was turning Iraq into a proper puppet state, like Iran was under the Shah. The United States just needed to quell the insurgency and assert its hard power dominance. It had always worked before, so why not now? There was no ideological rival, right? So this isn't the same as Vietnam, it should work this time. We just need to find the right puppet leader to replace Saddam Hussein, help prop him up no matter how corrupt he is, as long as he supports our regional interests and resource extraction, and it is all golden, right? Well, here's the problem. Saddam Hussein was our puppet leader. He was our strongman to begin with. During the Iran-Iraq War, we backed Saddam Hussein as a bulwark against regional instability. By our reckoning, he backstabbed us and invaded Kuwait, forcing us to respond to him. No, what the Middle East needed, the argument was not further puppet regimes, but American-style market-driven democracy. Liberal democracy. We could prove Fukuyama right once and for all. It's the end of history. There are no alternatives, and by wiping the slate clean in Iraq, we can build the groundwork for a thriving democracy. In reality, though, what we did was we opened the Iraqi market to looting by foreign interests. In 2003, the American Transitional Government, the Coalition Provisional Authority, or CPA, vested itself with executive, legislative, and judicial authority over the Iraqi government. Its very first act, CPA Order 1, was the de-Baathification of Iraqi society. The former ruling party was to be purged, which removed not only loyalists to Saddam, but almost the entirety of the administrative apparatus that had kept the country functioning. The CPA's second act, CPA Order 2, then formally disbanded the Iraqi army, as well as other public servants including doctors and nurses, which immediately created 500,000 unemployed and largely militarily trained young men. At the same time, the CPA set about dismantling Iraq's centrally planned economy, which prohibited foreign ownership of Iraqi businesses. CPA Order 17 granted all foreign contractors operating in Iraq immunity from the Iraqi legal process, a move taken straight out of the unequal treaty imperialism of the 1800s. CPA Order 49 provided a tax cut for corporations operating in Iraq. You get the picture, right? Iraq was to be pillaged by foreign interests. So the average Iraqi was suffering, their economy was being pillaged, and there was no army to maintain order, no bureaucracy to provide services, and no state to hold the country together. Just this foreign occupying power that had destroyed their homes, killed their loved ones, and invaded their country under false pretenses. From that sorrow, that confusion, that anger, the very same we all felt after 9/11, arose the insurgency. The Americans had ostensibly sought to bring freedom and democracy to Iraq, but now the Iraqi people were rising up to fight for freedom on their own terms. The United States fought against the insurgency with great brutality, and as the war grew desperate, with increasing cruelty as well. Imagery of civilians suffering due to the American occupation started to emerge in foreign media. The horrific acts of torture that were perpetrated by the Army and the CIA in Abu Ghraib prison became known to the public, for example. American hard power was failing, and soft power was failing alongside it. And before long, the war became a quagmire, a black hole into which America dumped men and resources. After 9/11, President Bush's approval rating hit as high as 90%. On May 1st, 2003, Bush stood in front of a banner that read "Mission Accomplished" and declared that major combat operations had ended. His approval rating at that point was around 69%. By 2005, as the situation in Iraq deteriorated into outright civil war, Bush's approval rating dropped to 35%. And by 2008, in the midst of the Great Recession, his approval rating cratered to as low as 25%. The cracks had begun to show in America's hard power dominance, and with it, the soft power veneer cracked too. Sure, Obama came after, and he was charismatic. He promised change, and he received a Nobel Peace Prize for the simple act of not being George Bush. But he was still fundamentally a neoliberal, and his policies were not altogether that different from his neoconservative counterparts.
So tonight, let us ask ourselves, if our children should live to see the next century, if my daughters should be so lucky to live as long as Ann Nixon Cooper, what change will they see? What progress will we have made?
They all still believed in and needed to support American primacy at any cost, and they still utilized American hard power to achieve that primacy. If you don't believe the theory, then argue with this logic: why did Reagan and Obama both go after Gaddafi? Thanks, Killer Mike. At the same time, alternatives were emerging. Competitors were emerging in the marketplace of ideas. Cuba and Iran were proving in different ways that nations could still thrive and even threaten the United States while completely cut off from international markets. The rise of China showed that perhaps other systems could meaningfully compete against neoliberal free market capitalism, maybe even outsmart it. In the present, the United States has declining popularity throughout the world. More and more countries, including our own allies, view the United States as irresponsible, irrational, and unreliable. China's approval rating, in contrast, has only grown. On April 3, 2026, Gallup reported, for example, that China had edged past the United States in global approval ratings. This is what the end of history actually looks like. This is the end of the American empire. But we'll talk more about the present in just a moment. Before we talk about the decline of America in the present, let's talk a little bit about Japan. What you just watched was a video of U.S. military personnel allegedly violating OPSEC during a recent HIMARS strike on Iran to make a cute video with their doll of Shion Yorigami, the, I kid you not, god of poverty. in Japanese bullet hell video game franchise Toho. Just casually sending poverty to Iran with the power of God and anime. But I digress. My point is, Japan is the best at soft power. And that's right, I spent like a quarter of a year grinding this video and lectured you for over 2 hours as a retort to YouTube comments. I will never do this again for as long as I live, and if I try to, please stop me. As I've said like 100 times in this video, American soft power is a shadow of American hard power. You see rock music and Western clothes in the free market, but behind it there are military bases, economic coercion, the CIA, and the threat of penalties if one fails to cooperate. The American hard power framework built out of coercive force leaves no choice for most state actors but to accept said framework. But Japan is trying something very different, and we will see if it can succeed on its merits. Japan, you see, is not a hegemonic power. Unlike the United States, Mearsheimer's model of offensive realism gets a little wonky here. Japan is undoubtedly an economically powerful country, but it is not allowed to become a regional hegemon through hard power, nor is it allowed to become an economic hegemon through hard power, as it is militarily and economically constrained by the United States, which imposes restrictions on its sovereignty. And Japan's government is propped up by American intelligence. Consider, for example, that the ruling Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, at its founding, received millions of dollars in funding and support from the CIA, as well as assistive CIA quote-unquote influence in elections thereafter, such as the plan to influence the 1965 Okinawan elections. In just 2025, the declassified Kennedy assassination files revealed that the CIA had a physical office in Tokyo, operating to manipulate Japanese politics. The LDP officially has stated that it wasn't aware of this covert assistance, but behind closed doors, these declassified documents revealed that the foreign minister and LDP president back in 1984 had intimate knowledge of the CIA's presence, as he stated to U.S. Ambassador Mondale the following, and I quote, "The LDP can deal with rumors and even unconfirmed leaks, but official confirmation of CIA activity in Japan would be an entirely different affair, threatening to damage both the conservative political leadership as well as the US-Japan security relationship." Those are his words, not mine. The conservative leadership you placed here and prop up will be damaged, as will the hard power relationship that underlines our obedience. The LDP has a long history of kowtowing to American interests over the interests of its own people. Consider how Japan's economy is at the mercy of American finance. Remember the Plaza Accord, or more recently, the 2025 US-Japan Framework Agreement, in which Japan committed $550 billion in investments and loans into US sectors like energy and semiconductors in exchange for reduced US tariffs. Many of those tariffs were challenged in court and in some cases found to be unlawful, suggesting that Japan may have been pressured into concessions under a framework that was at best dubious and at worst coercive. But while Japanese media has discussed withdrawing those investments made under pressure, no such withdrawal has happened, even as the Trump administration implements new tariffs on Japan, citing the Japanese use of quote-unquote forced labor as its reasoning. There's also, of course, Japan's military development, which is directly stifled by the American-drafted post-war Constitution of Japan. What then can Japan do to project its influence? How can it get around America's de facto hard power embargo? Well, it only has soft power, and Japan has been very purposefully utilizing its cultural and media products to generate goodwill and feelings towards the nation, in ways that are outside of the scope of American control. The LDP, for example, has very specifically singled out anime as a means of aligning audiences with Japanese values, and the government subsidizes, promotes abroad, and proliferates anime for that purpose. Japan relies on its cultural exports. It relies on Cool Japan. It relies on fashion, design, anime, cuisine, video games, tourism, music, TV, and even foreign aid and education programs to project its influence and power throughout the world. Japanese cultural products are beloved the world over. Japanese cuisine is seen as fancier and more highbrow than the cuisine of its neighbors. And we've all seen the meme, right? Thing Japan. If you think of Japan as a beautiful country of anime and takoyaki that can do no wrong, then when the topic of, say, war crimes or xenophobia comes up, you may be more inclined to defend not just Japan, but the talking points of LDP foreign policy. Which is to say that the war crimes are overstated / a hoax, and that xenophobia is different and necessary in Japan to protect its perfect culture. Don't take my word for it. Here's the stated intention, a direct quote as per this 2024 report from the Intellectual Property Strategy Headquarters issued directly from then Prime Minister Kishida's cabinet. And I quote, "Simultaneously, as the international political and economic situation becomes unstable, increasing the number of Japan fans," note the wording here, not anime fans, not manga fans, not J-pop fans, Japan fans. Increasing the number of Japan fans in the world is also important from the perspective of security. In addition to increasing the number of Japan fans around the world, we will work to enhance the brand value of Japan so that the people who make political and economic decisions and have influence in countries and regions around the world will also become Japan fans, making Japan an indispensable presence in the international community." End quote. That is soft power, the ability to get others to do what you want without coercion. But of course, these realities are also not completely detached from hard power. Japan is still a major economy and thus has economic hard power leverage. Japan is aligned with US security architecture, and in the recesses of its policymaking it has military and imperialist ambitions of its own, even if it likes to hide them. But when compared to the United States, the difference is night and day. The US has far more limited soft power than one thinks. One can hardly call America the best at soft power. It's the best at hard power, and that hard power provides an illusion of reality. An illusion that is soaked in blood and death, and a reality that is built on and maintained by violence. Imagine, if you will, that you are a student at a large school, and this school has a bully, one bully, who is way stronger than everyone else. The bully has the largest group of friends, the largest clique, and nobody dares to defy him because if they do, he and his friends will beat them up. If you're a student in this school, what do? Well, if you don't want to get beaten up, you stay out of the bully's way and you try not to get his attention. If you want the perks of being the bully's friend, though, you can do as he says. Maybe you and the bully hang out after school, maybe you help him beat up kids who he considers his enemies, but inside, you know, if you had the chance, you'd escape his orbit and perhaps be a better person. Maybe you can form your own group of friends, but the threat of force keeps you docile and obedient. Let's say, though, one day the bully beats up a kid, but you can tell that the bully seems more tired than usual. The fight took longer than expected, and he has more bruises than you've ever seen on him. The bully in his hubris sees only the mangled body of his victim on the ground. But everyone else notices not the victim's suffering, but the bully's weakness. Slowly but surely, the bully can no longer control the school as easily as he did before. Cracks begin to form. The students at the school stop asking, well, what happens if I defy him? And they start considering instead, well, what happens if everyone else defies him together? In time, the bully begins to notice that his quote-unquote friends are pulling away. He notices that when he bullies kids, they're more willing to fight back instead of pay up. He sees other strong kids banding together to resist him, and he finds that he can no longer push them around. As the fear of the bully slowly subsides, so too does his ability to control the school. And the other students, who remember the bully's cruelty, abandon him the moment he grows too weak to enforce his regime. The fear of the bully is what predicates American soft power, and as we're seeing play out in real time, America is still reaching for the same tools it has used for 2 centuries. The Monroe Doctrine, now called the Monroe Doctrine, dollar diplomacy, sanctions, debt, military force, and stability language for the purposes of extraction. The difference between the past and the present, though, is that the old bargain is breaking down. The fear of being beaten up is fading, and the perks of being the bully's friend are also fading. What incentive, then, is there to side with the bully? For most of the 20th century, American hegemony could present itself as a rising tide. The system was unequal, yes, but its defenders could argue that the inequality was tolerable because everyone was still better off inside the system than outside of it. But what happens when the tide stops rising? What happens when the system offers all of the coercion and none of the bargain, all of the dependency and none of the security, all of the discipline but none of the prosperity? What happens when you omit speak softly and only carry the big stick? What happens when you go all stick and no carrot, all me but no you? This, in essence, is the problem of America First. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of American liberalism and the coercive power it wields. It is believing your own propaganda that the superiority of the American system is what keeps the American world order in place. The American First stance of Donald Trump and his political base on the right, whatever you choose to call it, sees the carrot parts of liberalism as superfluous and even charitable. Why do we have these expensive military bases everywhere? Why do we have these trade deals that allow Mexico or the EU or Canada or China to take advantage of our markets? Why are we giving all of this money to the UN or to humanitarian causes through US aid? Why do we allow others to take advantage of us? Their solution to the weakening influence of the bully is to be an even bigger bully. No more perks. If you don't obey us, you get beat up, you get tariffed, you get trade war, you get couped, you get sanctioned, you get your country bombed, quote unquote, back to the Stone Age. What they don't understand is that America first means America alone. And to be fair, the liberal doesn't understand either that NAFTA / the USMCA, the WTO, the IMF, US aid, and the like aren't soft power either. Ask many African nations how they feel about the IMF and the World Bank, for example, or how most Canadians view trade with the United States. At best, they see these things as pragmatic necessities in an American-dominated world. At worst, they consider these things neo-colonial and extractive. Any deal with America is a Faustian bargain. If you deal with the devil, you reap the consequences.
So let's see how you respond. America is backing you with overwhelming strength and devastating force. Now is the time to seize control of your destiny and to unleash the prosperous and glorious future that is close within your reach.
On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a war against the second nation in Bush's axis of evil, targeting the so-called rogue nation of Iran. Why is Iran a rogue nation? Because, according to Vice President J.D. Vance, it doesn't act like a quote-unquote normal country. And if only Iran was willing to act like a normal country, it would be treated by the United States like a normal country. But what is a normal country? Is a normal country a non-theocracy? Well, that can't be it, because Saudi Arabia is a theocracy, and that's one of our allies. No, a normal country is a country that goes along with the rules-based international order. A set of global rules based on economic and political liberalism that benefits primarily the United States. If Joseph Nye's rising tide lifts all boats, we should all be happy. But the tide isn't rising for everyone, and indeed the water has been trickling down more than it's been rising up. And as even that trickle dries up, as liberalism marches headlong into the inevitable techno-feudalism of late-stage capitalism, the cracks in the American international order are growing simply too big to ignore. America no longer has the overwhelming military power necessary to crush any other country on Earth that it once did. It struggled in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is outright failing in Iran. It doesn't have the manufacturing capacity to sustain conflict against even far weaker regional opponents. It cannot protect its own military bases or allies against the weapons of an enemy it has economically sanctioned for decades. It, with the largest and most advanced navy in the world, with its 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and 75 guided missile destroyers, cannot stop a nation whose naval capabilities have been reduced to speedboats and flying lawnmowers from closing a strait of water only 20 to 30 miles wide. America's economic power is waning as well. In the year 2000, the United States was the largest trading partner of virtually every nation on Earth. Take a look at the year 2024 in comparison. China has reached a degree of trade dominance that even the United States at its peak couldn't reach. And with that declining economic power, even the almighty dollar is starting to slip. When Iran charged tolls for transiting the Strait of Hormuz, it did so in Chinese yuan, because with Chinese economic dominance growing, there's an economy that exists now outside of the US scope of influence. We've even seen American clandestine power weaken, with botched operations recently in Mexico and Iran. We've been shooting wildly from the hip, oftentimes blind to the intentions of our friends and enemies alike. There's even been a decline in American media control and propaganda. In January of 1948, the U.S. Congress passed the U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act to develop regulated broadcasting of programs for foreign, but not domestic audiences, produced under the guidance of the State Department, i.e. government propaganda. This act was modernized as part of the 2013 National Defense Authorization Act, which in turn authorized $600 billion for defense, a number which has since ballooned to $900 billion in 2026. And the Trump administration has requested $1.5 trillion for fiscal year 2027. Even with a frankly almost infinite amount of money and permission to directly deploy propaganda weapons against all peoples both foreign and domestic, the narrative war is failing. Because one cannot just lean on the might of so-called American soft power, the alleged superiority of our system when hard power is failing. Leaders from Canada, the UK, and Europe engage more openly with America's hegemonic rival in China. For example, in January of 2026, Canada signed a reciprocal trade agreement with China, allowing Chinese electric vehicles into Canada in exchange for lowered agricultural tariffs. If the deal goes well, the Chinese may even begin manufacturing electric cars in Canada. Canada gets jobs in manufacturing, and China, well, China gets to sell its cars in North America and potentially even in the United States. We've seen Southeast Asian countries cozying up to China too. In just April of 2026, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar, positioning China as the major power defending stability, trade, and cooperation in the region. Thai Foreign Minister Sihasak Phuongketkeow, in the meantime, criticized the United States for offering no help with the Iran war's fallout. Even Vietnam, which has deep historical animosity towards China, is strengthening ties. Vietnamese President To Lam's first overseas trip since his election just a week prior was to China. Lam stated, according to the Associated Press, that, quote, Vietnam would regard developing relations with China as its objective need, strategic choice, and top priority. Global perception is shifting. According to Gallup, China's global approval rating in 2025 edged past the United States by the widest margin in nearly 2 decades. And this discrepancy is only likely to grow. There's a reason why everyone's in a very Chinese time of their life right now, and it has much to do with the rise of China as it does with the fall of America. China is the perfect example of how a communist, centrally controlled economy can grow beyond even the power of the hegemonic US if the US buys into its own soft power rhetoric and propaganda. The theory was this: if we brought China into the World Trade Organization and opened our markets to China and flooded China with Western capital, our wealth flowing into China will cause China to become more like us. This theory was called convergence. Ultimately, though, the very opposite occurred. As American companies entered China and became fabulously wealthy there, they developed incentives to defend their access to Chinese markets, Chinese labor, and Chinese manufacturing. As such, instead of China simply becoming more like America, Western capital became structurally invested in the rise of China, going so far as to lobby for Chinese interests, a theory called reverse convergence. But Chinese soft power is a video for another time. And don't comment something like China isn't communist, Mooney, or the next 3-hour video I said I wouldn't make is going to be targeted at you. The point is, as Mao Zedong once said, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And sure, offensive realism is just a theory. It is but one model, which is not necessarily universally applicable. But it sure is applicable to the United States. We are making the same mistakes again, predicated on the same poor understanding of history and context. I mean, for goodness sake, with regards to Hezbollah in Lebanon, Donald Trump says Syria will do the job. That's right, Ahmad al-Shara and the HTS, the successor group to Jabhat al-Nusra, the official affiliate in Syria of al-Qaeda, is our secret weapon. And I'm sure our brave Mujahideen fighters will work out for us this time. Robert Kagan, arch-neoconservative and member of PNAC, claims that the end is nigh for Trump in the Iran war. Francis Fukuyama has stated that he was wrong about the end of history and about the China model, which he now claims is potentially superior to that of the United States when we look at material results for the people. And as for Joseph Nye, well, he passed away at the age of 88 back in May of 2025. He never got to see the coup in Venezuela or the war in Iran or whatever war is coming next, be it Cuba or Mexico or Colombia. He got to see his theory of soft power, his perspective of so-called ethical hegemony, fade over his lifetime. But he will be fortunate enough not to experience it die altogether. It is all of us who must live in the shadow of its consequences. And as America's carefully constructed global house of cards collapses, it faces the same conflict that many failing empires in history encountered. It can do things the easy way and adapt to a multipolar world, or it can do things the hard way and attempt to restore its position through force, coercion, and escalation. But history teaches us, unfortunately, that great powers, more often than not, choose the hard way.
There's nothing wrong with criticizing your government when it's doing something foolish. In fact, one could argue that that's the highest form of patriotism, that you're willing to criticize your government, you're willing to subject yourself to being criticized for being anti-American or not a good American. But that's not my idea of what a good American is.
Mooney, I can hear you say, after all of this negative talk about America, you, as an American, must really hate your country. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. I love my country. But loving your country, like loving your child or your sibling or your partner, doesn't mean loving it blindly. When we put anything on a pedestal, when you idealize it, when you idolize it, you detach yourself from reality, and erode both your agency and the agency of what you pedestalize. After all, if one is without flaws, then why change? To love your country means wanting it to become the best version of itself. America isn't holy, it isn't exceptional in some way, but it isn't all bad either. There is a version of America worth loving as well. The America I love is its people. We the people who have always had to drag this country kicking and screaming towards some brighter, less bloody, more cooperative future. We the people who fought and died to end the grotesque practice of slavery. We the people who struggled to gain equal rights for racial, sexual, and gender minorities. We the people who organized in factories, fields, and offices for the dignity and humanity of every worker around the world. This is the America I love. That is the America worth fighting for. That is the America I believe in. And yet as I speak, the other America, the unaccountable America, the exceptional America, the imperial America, the corporate America is starving Cuba and North Korea, enabling genocide in Gaza, and threatening genocide in Iran. There's someone right now at this very moment who is dying of hunger due to our sanctions. There are children out there who are terrified of clear blue skies because of our drone strikes. There is a world held hostage by our greed, our pride, and our hubris. Who could possibly believe in that America? That America is not believed in by choice. It is instead tolerated at gunpoint. But as the fire in the cave sputters out, as the light fades, so too does the shadow. All that remains is a stark realism that is, in every sense of the word, offensive. I've been your host, Mooney. I know there's a lot we didn't get to, but this is a topic with enough nuance for 1,000 videos, and I did my best for you in one. I started working on this video back in November of 2025, and a lot has happened geopolitically since then. I, as a lawyer, usually make content around law and video games, but I do have a background in political science and international relations, so if this kind of content is interesting to you, let me know. Maybe we can do some more of it. Nothing this long, though. In any case, Moon Channel donates 10% of its gross income to Doctors Without Borders. Your patronage here on YouTube, but especially on Patreon, makes that a reality for us. We, together, can make a difference. We must not give in to the nihilistic notion that we are powerless. A special thanks then to Larita Shine, Siva Gunner, and Moon Channel's dearly beloved patrons without whom none of this would be possible. And thank you, all of you, for tuning in to Moon Channel. The song I'm about to sing for you is a parody of a Christian hymn originally performed by social activist Pete Seeger. You know, funny thing, Pete Seeger, Donald Trump, and I all come from the same denomination of Christianity, and we are all New Yorkers. Trump and I used to attend the same church even. In any case, here's the parody.
What a friend we have in Congress, who will guard our every shore, spends 3/4 of our taxes fighting endless foreign war. Guns must make our coastline bristle, and we have to fill the skies full of drones and guided missiles. They'll be paid for by and by. Have you noticed all the progress of our mighty naval fleet? By the time a ship's adopted, it's already obsolete. Modern bombs are sure to carry loads of glory, joy, and thrills. What a privilege to bury all the dead our money kills.